Chapter 27. A message from one Bill. As I left the arena, the weight of exhaustion bore down on me like a lead blanket. The crowd's cheers still echoed in my ears, a hollow victory ringing out for the solitary defender. My legs felt unsteady, my breathing labored, and a faint ache throbbed in every muscle. Profile. Name, Wolfhart Valda Ashdock. Age, 15. Race, human, adult male. Class, Void Architect. Underscore. Level, 1. Health, 45,320. Mana, 2,400. Strength, 50. Dexterity, 90. Endurance, 65. Intelligence, 115. Wisdom, 75. Skills, Shadow Gate, Graviton Trap, Void Barricade, Mana Adaptable Blood, Active, Void Master, Void Oppression, Void That Licks, Solace. Hex's voice, distant and mechanical, echoed in my mind. Mana and health levels critically low. Immediate recovery is recommended. I know, I muttered weakly, dragging myself across the courtyard. I had taken for hits than I thought my youthful body and adrenaline kept me going more than anything else. The sun was bright, casting short shadows across the campus. The warm light failed to lift my spirits, my focus was on the mock battle I had just completed. What would my ranking be? I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't notice the group of students blocking the path until I almost walked into them. There were 3 of them, scrappy and underfed, their uniforms faded and patched in places. They looked like they belonged to Ava's year, younger than me but with a kind of feral desperation in their eyes. Fish boy, one of them sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. My stomach dropped. What do you want? I asked, trying to sound steadier than I felt. The tallest of the group stepped forward, holding a wooden stick he tapped menacingly against his palm. One Bill says you don't just ignore him. Time's up, fish boy. Before I could react, the first blow came, a sharp crack to my ribs that sent me staggering backward. The pain was immediate, sharp and unrelenting. Health, 38,320. Hex's detached voice chimed in, a grim reminder of how little room for error I had left. Where's the package? Another boy demanded, grabbing me by the collar and shaking me. Give it to us, and maybe we won't have to beat it out of you. I didn't answer. My lips stayed sealed. I don't know why, but I wasn't giving these little shits the living mana. It'd settle things with one Bill my own way. The next strike came faster than I could register, a fist to my stomach that knocked the wind out of me. Health, 3,320. Bleeding detected. I doubled over, clutching my side as another boy swung his stick, hitting the side of my head. Stars exploded in my vision, and the world tilted violently. Health, 2,320. Warning, risk of unconsciousness imminent. They didn't stop. Fists, sticks, kicks, each hit chipped away at my health, the numbers flashing in my mind like a cruel taunt. Blood dripped from my nose, soaking into my uniform as the pain blurred into a dull, throbbing haze. Stop, please stop, the words tumbled out of me, weak and broken. One of the boys spat on the ground next to me. Not until you hand over the package, fish boy. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't fight back. A piercing scream shattered the haze. Get away from him. It was Ava. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. The boys hesitated, their heads snapping toward her. Her silhouette was framed by the light of the sun, her fists clenched at her sides. Aw shit, she will call a teacher, run. One of the boys shouted, panic lacing his voice. They scattered like rats, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd come. The last one turned back briefly, shouting, we'll find the package, fish boy. You can't hide it forever. Their words hung in the air, a chilling promise that sent shivers down my spine. Ava rushed to my side, her face pale with worry as she knelt beside me. Wolfhart. Are you okay? I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was nod weakly as tears blurred my vision. You're bleeding, she cried, her hands hovering uncertainly over my battered frame. We need to get you to the infirmary. No. I croaked, my voice barely audible. Just help me back to the dorm. She hesitated, her brow furrowing in concern. You need medical attention. Please, I interrupted, my voice cracking. Just the dorm. Reluctantly, she nodded, slipping an arm under my shoulders and helping me to my feet. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to keep moving, the weight of the living mana heavier than ever in my mind. As we reached the dormitory, Hex's voice finally broke the silence in my head. You need to address this, Wolfhart. Ignoring one bill is no longer an option. I know, I whispered, my voice trembling. I know. Ava looked at me, her eyes full of questions she didn't ask. I couldn't meet her gaze. As she helped me into my bed, the only thought running through my mind was how much worse things were about to get. The morning light streamed through the dormitory windows, casting pale streaks across the bruises mottling my face. My broken nose ached with every breath, and the faint purple shadow under my eye felt like a mocking reminder of yesterday's ambush. I shifted painfully in my chair, adjusting the double-sacked living mana tucked beneath my coat. The glowing warmth of the item was a cruel contrast to my aching body, a constant reminder of its value and the storm it had brought into my life. Class dragged on, the teachers droning on about topics that I barely registered. My classmates stole glances at me, whispers trailing in their wake. Some of them laughed quietly at my disheveled state, while others cast curious or concerned looks in my direction. None of it mattered. You need medical attention, Wolfhart, Hexa said, her voice breaking through my haze of exhaustion. I'll live, I muttered under my breath. Just keep watch for anything suspicious. Suspicious? You're sitting in a classroom. During the midday break, I found a quiet corner in the library and finally checked my band. A small red icon blinked insistently, indicating multiple unread messages. I hesitated before tapping the first one. Hey, fish boy, one Bill's voice came through with an unsettling mix of humor and irritation. It's been a while, huh? Look, I get it. You're probably shaken up, but you're smarter than this. We both know you're holding on to something you shouldn't. Bring me the package, and we can set this all straight. No harm, no foul. The next message followed immediately, his tone now sharp and clipped. Don't make me wait, kid. You don't want to find out how impatient I can get. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. The third message was different, almost soft. Listen, Wolfhart. I like you. I really do. You've got guts, and you've proven you can handle yourself. I don't want things to go south between us. You deliver that package, and this all goes away. Simple as that. But the tone shifted again in the fourth message, the veneer of patience slipping. You're pushing it now, fish boy. My generosity has limits. You think you can ghost me? This isn't some schoolyard game. You're in my world now, and if you don't step up, someone else will. They won't be as nice about it, either. The final message was the worst. His voice dropped into a low, menacing growl, but there was a false sweetness to it, like a predator trying to soothe its prey. Clock's ticking, kid. I don't want to do this, but you're leaving me no choice. Deliver the package, and you'll be golden. Keep playing this game, and, well, you won't like the ending. Think about it, fish boy. I know you're smart enough to make the right call. The silence that followed was suffocating. The progression of his tone, from cajoling to threatening, left me sick to my stomach. That night, I sat in my room, the double-sacked living mana resting on the desk before me. Its glow seeped through the fabric, casting an otherworldly light across the walls. I stared at it, my thoughts spiraling into a dark abyss. It wasn't just an item. It was something more, something powerful, coveted, and dangerous. I didn't understand it, but I could feel its weight in my life. Gid and Sona had died for this, and now one bill had made it clear my life wasn't worth much more unless I delivered it. Wolfhart, Hexa finally spoke, her tone measured. You're fixating. Step away from it. Sleep. Reassess in the morning. I just want to know why, I whispered. Why is it worth so much? What makes it so special? Living mana is rare and highly potent, but tampering with it could. Could what? I snapped, cutting her off. Could make me more of a target? Could make my life harder? It already is. The silence in my head was deafening. I thought of Gid and Sona, of their laughter and plans for the future. Now they were gone, their lives snuffed out in an instant. I thought of Ava, her tear-streaked face etched with worry and confusion. And I thought of myself, as Johnathan, the 30-year-old man who never achieved anything, who wasted his life chasing momentary pleasures and fleeting distractions. Why is everything so damn hard? I whispered. The disparity of power in this world was suffocating. Nobles with wealth and influence, mages with perfect affinities, soldiers trained from birth to fight. And here I was, struggling to scrape by, caught in a web of crime and danger I barely understood. You can't let it consume you, Hexa said, her voice cutting through my thoughts. You've come too far to fall into this spiral. But her words barely registered. My gaze remained fixed on the glowing sack. I just want to be stronger, I muttered, my voice shaking. Stronger than all of them. Strong enough to survive in this damn world. Wolfhart, don't. Hex's voice was sharp now, panic creeping into her usually neutral tone. But it was too late. Driven by desperation, anger, and the overwhelming desire for power, I reached out, pulling the sack open to reveal the glowing, crystalline structure inside. The living mana wasn't just a stone, it was a pulsating, lattice-like network, shifting and shimmering as if it were alive. Faint streaks of light moved within it, like veins carrying energy. Do not engage it. It's not stable. Hexa tries again. But I couldn't stop myself. My fingers closed around the crystalline structure, and the moment I made full contact, it came alive. The living mana reacted instantly, its glow intensifying as a hum filled the air. Threads of light began to stream outward, weaving intricate patterns in the air around my hand. It was mesmerizing, like watching data being processed on a grand, physical scale. "What is it doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Unknown process detected," Hexa said, her tone edged with panic. "The structure is not behaving like ambient mana or any known magical material. Wolfhart, release it." But the mana had other plans. The glowing threads began to wrap around my fingers, moving with a purpose that felt almost sentient. They weren't just random streams of energy, they were assembling something, constructing pathways that fed into my body. I gasped as the first thread pierced my skin, not with pain, but with an overwhelming surge of energy. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before, clean, sharp, and electric. My vision blurred as more threads followed, their movements synchronized as if they were part of a grand design. "Hexa, what's happening?" "Registering, confirmed. It's integrating," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reverent. "The energy is bypassing your mana pool entirely. It's embedding itself into your core systems." Chapter 28, Consumption. The glowing veins across my hand pulsed in rhythm with the pounding in my head. Then, like a thunderclap inside my skull, the voice boomed. "Direct consumption of primary resource core detected. System analyzing. Analyzing complete. Purpose detected. System enhancement selected." I clutched my head as if I could stop the voice from tearing through me. Hex's usual chatter was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. "Evolution commencing. Level 1 evolution detected. Special trait awarded. Special trait awarded. Special trait awarded." The words rattled through my being, each one carving itself into my mind. My body burned with an intensity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Soulless skill detected. Special trait awarded." I barely registered the words as I was overwhelmed by a sudden, icy numbness that spread through me like a tidal wave. "Void class detected. Analyzing. Level 4 permissions detected. Special void trait forcibly awarded." It felt like the void itself was dragging me deeper into its abyss, pulling apart every fiber of my existence only to reweave it stronger, darker, and more alien. "Evolution complete. Void architect is now void shaper." And then, silence. The pain ebbed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a cold, electric hum coursing through my body. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to sit up. A surge of raw power crackled beneath my skin, a pulse of darkness that felt both foreign and intoxicating. "Wolfhart," Hex's voice finally returned, sharp and frantic, "your profile. It's updated," I finished for her, already sensing the monumental shift. I pulled up the familiar overlay in my mind, watching as it populated with new information. Profile. Name, Wolfhart Valda Ashdock. Age, 15. Race, human, adult male. Class, void shaper. Level, 1. Health, 445-720. Mana, 320-800. Strength, 150. Dexterity, 190. Endurance, 165. Intelligence, 215. Wisdom, 175. Skills. Shadow Gate. Graviton Trap. Void Barricade. Mana Adaptable Blood, Active Void Master. Void Oppression, Active Void that licks. Soulless. Corrupted _ level 4 Rediac 4 Ed Sin Skill, Greed. Sin Skill, Resentment. Evolution Trait, Sovereign Ascendance. Your stats. They've increased dramatically, but Hexa cuts in after learning my profile updates fully. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. I could feel it, the subtle shift within me, like a thread of hunger had been stitched into my very being. Greed and resentment hummed faintly in the back of my mind, quiet but undeniable presences, their influence lurking just beneath the surface. The description unfolded in my mind like a cold, mechanical whisper. Greed was a passive ability, driving an insatiable need for gain. It didn't manifest as a direct attack but instead amplified my abilities whenever I sought personal benefit. Resources gathered would yield more, mana drained from enemies would fill my reserves more efficiently. It was a skill designed for exploitation, and it thrummed with a dangerous allure. Sin skill, greed. Type, passive. Description: the user's insatiable desire for personal gain manifests as an innate ability to extract maximum benefit from every action. Effect: enhances resource gathering and mana absorption. Gains from defeated enemies and scavenged items are amplified. Unique ability: mana drain amplification. Mana drain from enemies replenishes the user's reserves at 150% efficiency. Resentment was no less insidious. It sharpened my focus and bolstered my strength in the face of opposition, feeding off my bitterness and anger. The more I felt wronged or opposed, the stronger I became, turning my frustration into a tangible weapon. Sin skill, resentment type, passive. Description: fueled by bitterness and anger, this skill turns frustration into power. The more opposition faced, the stronger the user becomes. Effect: increases strength, dexterity, and mana regeneration proportional to the intensity of perceived opposition or wrongdoings. Unique ability: reprisal boost, when struck by an enemy, grants a temporary increase in damage output. These aren't just skills, Wolfhart, Hexa warned. They're a pathway to isolation. If people find out, they'll shun me, I finished, the weight of her words settling heavily on my shoulders. As the glow of the living mana faded and the new entries settled into my profile, a chill ran through me. The word sin skill felt heavier than any other part of my evolution. I didn't fully understand the implications, but something about it gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering that these were abilities I shouldn't have. Hexa, I said, my voice unsteady, what do people actually know about sin skills? I don't think I've seen anyone else with them. There was a long pause before her voice finally echoed in my mind. Sin skills are complicated. They're not forbidden outright, but the stigma surrounding them is almost as bad. Why? I asked, my brows furrowing. They're just skills. Useful ones, even. Because they're not just skills, Wolfhart. They're marks, visible signs of deep personal flaws, or at least that's what the church believes. Sin skills are seen as a godly warning, a divine punishment that brands those who acquire them as untrustworthy, dangerous, and morally compromised. I stared at my hands, the faint mana veins still visible from the integration. Punishment? For what? I didn't ask for this. That doesn't matter to most people. The church preaches that sin skills are earned through selfishness, greed, resentment, or betrayal. They mark you as a sinner in the eyes of society, a person who's allowed dangerous emotions or impulses to dictate their path. Hexa continued, her voice tinged with what felt like unease. The Church of the Nexus is deeply ingrained in the Ash Kingdom's culture, and across much of the Nexus of Worlds, for that matter. They're not just religious, they're political, social, and even military forces. Their teachings shape public perception, and one of their core beliefs is that sin skills are warnings from the gods. I frowned, trying to recall anything I'd learned about the church in my time here. Nothing came to mind. Wolfhart, Hexa said, as if reading my thoughts, you've ignored almost every lecture about the church's role in society, haven't you? Maybe, I admitted. I barely even registered they existed. Back on Earth, I didn't believe in anything like gods or divine punishment. Religion was just there. Something other people cared about. That was a mistake, Hexa said bluntly. This world isn't like Earth. The gods are real here, at least, real enough to affect society, and their marks carry weight. The church enforces the idea that anyone with a sin skill is inherently flawed, even dangerous. They'll see you as a potential threat, a cautionary tale, or worse, a heretic. The word heretic hit harder than I expected. So, what? People will just avoid me? Look at me funny in the streets? It's more than that, Wolfhart. You'll be shunned. Ostracized. Even if you try to keep your skills hidden, anyone who finds out will see you as a liability. They'll think you're manipulative, untrustworthy, and morally bankrupt. You won't get allies. You won't get sympathy. You'll get fear and suspicion. Hexa's words dredged up a memory I'd buried from my first year at the academy, a lecture I'd tuned out, more focused on sketching the Nexus in my notebook than paying attention to the professor. You remember now, don't you? Hexa said, her tone cutting. The fragmented pieces of that long-forgotten lecture floated back into my mind. The professor had spoken about the Church's teachings on sin skills, detailing their history as divine warnings. Those who possessed them were often treated as pariahs, their every action scrutinized through the lens of their supposed flaws. The Church taught that these skills were gifts from the gods meant to challenge the user to overcome their basest instincts, or else fall deeper into sin. The professor had even mentioned a phrase that stuck with me now: a sinner's mark is not a blessing but a test, and most fail it. Why didn't you remind me about this earlier? I asked Hexa, my voice rising. I assumed you'd retained at least some of your early education. I didn't realize you were so dismissive of the Church. I groaned, running a hand through my hair. I thought it didn't matter. None of this mattered back then. I didn't think the gods were actually watching. They are, Hexa said softly. And so is everyone else. The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket. Greed and resentment weren't just tools, they were brands, burning into my very identity. My soulless nature only made it worse. Without emotions to temper my decisions, I'd likely embody the very qualities that would make people fear me: cold, calculating, exploitative. What am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice cracking. How am I supposed to navigate this world when everything about me is a walking taboo? You adapt, Hexa said firmly. You hide what you can, use what you must, and prove to the world that you're more than their labels. But Wolfhart, you have to be careful. You're on thin ice, and one misstep could send you plummeting into a pit you can't climb out of. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the faint glow of the veins on my hand. The gods had given me power, but they'd also cursed me with the weight of their judgment. My path forward wasn't just about surviving, it was about proving, to myself and the world, that I could control the darkness inside me. Fine, I said quietly. I'll figure it out. But if anyone tries to treat me like a villain, they're going to learn just how wrong they are. Hexa's voice softened. I hope you're right, Wolfhart. For both our sakes. The next morning, I dragged myself out of bed, every movement stiff and aching from the previous day. My bruises, now a dull purple, served as a constant reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything, not just the living mana but my life. My nose throbbed with every step, a permanent thrum of pain from the beating I'd taken. Hexa had been quiet, which made everything worse. Her silence was more oppressive than her anger ever had been. As I walked into the academy, every set of eyes felt like they were on me. Identify was common enough that anyone with the right spell or an enchanted ring could see my profile. It wouldn't take long before someone saw my evolution, Void Shaper. A class like mine wasn't just rare, it was outright suspicious, especially with the sin skills stamped on my record. When I arrived at the sparsely populated Advanced Affinity classroom, Morgana Ash was already there. The only other student in my class for the year, Morgana sat at her desk with her usual effortless poise, her sharp green eyes locking onto me the moment I walked through the door. She gave me a sly smile, brushing a stray strand of her auburn hair behind her ear. Wolfhart, she greeted, her tone amused, you look like you got hit by a runaway horse. Something like that, I muttered, avoiding her gaze. I took my seat, pretending to focus on arranging my books and quills. But Morgana wasn't the type to let awkward silences slide. She leaned closer, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. You hear the latest gossip? It's all anyone in the noble circles can talk about. I glanced at her, wary but curious. What? Some group of thieves managed to steal the crown prince's coronation jewel, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. It was a gift from the elves, supposedly infused with their ancient mana. Without it, he won't be able to gain a level 1 evolution trait. My stomach dropped, my mind immediately flashing to the living mana now nestled under my jacket. It couldn't be. Could it? Morgana raised an eyebrow at my reaction, her tone becoming more probing. Apparently, if they don't find it soon, he'll have to forego his birthright entirely. It's causing chaos behind the scenes. The royal family is scrambling to figure out how the thieves pulled it off. I forced a laugh, my voice shaky. Yeah, that sounds bad. Bad? Morgana repeated, her gaze narrowing. It's catastrophic. The crown prince losing his evolution trait would be a disaster for the kingdom. You'd think they'd have better security for something that important. I nodded absently, my mind spiraling. Morgana's words barely registered anymore. If anyone connected the dots, if they discovered I had the living mana, it wouldn't just mean trouble. It would mean ruin. Expulsion from the academy. Losing my only refuge from one Bill and his lackeys. And worse, being hunted by both the crown and the underworld. Class began, but I didn't hear a word of it. The professor's lecture faded into a dull buzz as my thoughts churned. The academy had already given me a tenuous sense of safety, but that safety relied on the idea that I was just another student. If my profile, or worse, the living mana, was discovered, everything would come crashing down. Hexa, ever aware of my mental state, broke her silence. You're panicking. Stop. Focus. Easy for you to say, I thought back bitterly. You're not the one who could lose everything. My thoughts still spiraling. At the end of class, I drifted toward the central plaza. The central plaza buzzed with energy as students crowded around the massive mana-powered ranking board. The shimmering surface displayed names, team placements, and individual performances from the opening ranking matches, shifting every few seconds as it cycled through the list. Voices overlapped in excited whispers and exclamations, some filled with pride, others tinged with disappointment. I hesitated at the edge of the crowd, still nursing the dull ache in my ribs from the beating I'd taken. Every movement felt like a reminder of my current weakness, but something pushed me forward. I needed to know how I'd measured up, whether my solo strategy, chaotic as it was, had been enough to make an impression. Pushing through the throng of students, I craned my neck to see the board. As the names flickered past, I felt my stomach churn. Then, there it was. 12th place, Wolfhart Valda Ashdok. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought I'd misread. I blinked and looked again, but it was still there. 12th place. Higher than I had dared to hope, and well above teams of 4 that should have had the advantage of coordination and combined skills. Around me, the murmurs began. 12th? That's the solo guy, isn't it? No way. He ranked above Team Galen? They're all nobles. How does one person beat teams? That's not possible. Probably luck. Or cheating. The last comment stung, but I forced myself to focus on the screen instead of their words. I knew better. There had been no cheating, just raw determination, desperation, and an iron focus on survival. It was messy, and it hurt like hell, but it had worked. As I stood there, staring at my name, the reality of my situation began to sink in. 12th wasn't just a number. It was validation, proof that I wasn't as far behind as I'd feared. That despite the stigma of my class, the whispers about me, and the bruises on my body, I could still hold my own. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I clenched my fists, ignoring the dull pain in my knuckles. The ranking was a start, but the capital of Ash had shown me the limits of what I could achieve here. This wasn't a place where I could thrive, not as a second son, not as someone with void powers, and certainly not with one bill's bounty hanging over my head. The thought of being a second son gnawed at me. I wasn't alone in that. Most of the academy's students were second sons, sent here to forge their own paths because their elder siblings were destined to inherit everything. But the difference was stark. They came with the backing of noble families, with gold, connections, and carefully laid plans. I had nothing but a fading fishing village to my name and a family struggling just to survive. Being a second son in Valda Ashdok meant you were disposable, a pawn for the kingdom's needs, sent to fight, defend, or die so the village could thrive. Here, it meant you were expected to carve out your future through power, influence, or sheer audacity. I was starting to see that even here, the system was rigged. The nobles had their safety nets, their mentors, and their resources. I had me. Hex's voice interrupted my thoughts. 12th place, Wolfhart. That's impressive. With refinement, you could easily climb higher. Maybe, I muttered under my breath. But not here. The capital of Ash has taught me all it can. Hexa was quiet for a moment before responding. You're thinking about leaving. Not thinking, I said, my voice firm. Deciding. This place isn't meant for someone like me. It's time to move on. As the crowd continued to murmur around me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was pride in what I'd accomplished. 12th place as a solo competitor wasn't just luck, but also a deep frustration. This city, this academy, was supposed to be the gateway to power, but instead, it had become a cage. Every step I took forward came with chains pulling me back, the nobles who would always look down on me, the whispers about my class, and now, one Bill and his threats. I thought of Valda Ashdok, of my father and Halric fighting off raids while I tried to find my way here. My family didn't have the luxury of falling apart. They didn't have the option to break down when things got hard. They survived. They endured. And here I was, standing in the capital, with power and potential that should have been a blessing but felt more like a curse. The ranking board flickered again, and I glanced at the names above mine. Names of nobles, prodigies, and those who had everything handed to them. I was proud of 12th place, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough if I stayed here. This is just the beginning, I muttered, more to myself than to Hexa. It's time to leave the starter city. Hexa's voice was calm, but there was a hint of approval in her tone. You're thinking like a MMO player again. I know, I said, the faintest smile tugging at my lips. That's the point. The murmurs of the crowd faded as I turned away from the board. My bruises still ached, my nose throbbed, and my mana reserves felt like they'd been wrung dry, but none of that mattered anymore. I had a plan. I didn't know exactly where I'd go or how I'd get there, but I knew one thing: the capital of Ash wasn't the end of my journey. It was just the tutorial zone. The whispers followed me as I walked away, but I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them wonder. I had proven I could survive, and now, I would prove I could thrive. Chapter 29, Moving On. The first step to leaving a place like the capital of Ash wasn't deciding to leave, it was deciding how. It was a problem that consumed my every waking moment, gnawing at the edges of my focus during classes and creeping into my restless dreams at night. One Bill's threats had been enough to drive home the truth: the capital wasn't safe for me anymore. My days were numbered, not just by the criminals who wanted me dead, but by the noble elite and their hunger for gossip and intrigue. The jewel, the evolution, the whispers of Sin skills, it all tied me into a web that could snap shut at any moment. I couldn't afford to stay. The first thing I did was hoard food. The Academy's cafeteria served well-preserved goods, dried meats, hard biscuits, and other provisions meant for long-term storage. I carefully pocketed portions from every meal, slowly building a stockpile hidden beneath my mattress. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to last until I could find something more sustainable. Hexa was silent during most of this planning, though I could feel her quiet calculations in the back of my mind. I had come to recognize the subtle hum of her processes when she was analyzing, mapping, or planning. Hexa, I whispered one night as I slipped another handful of dried fruit into my stash. How far is the forest kingdom of Drugger from here? Her response was instant. Approximately 240 miles east. With consistent travel in a caravan, it would take 3 to 4 weeks, depending on weather and road conditions. And from Drugger to the world city of Pict? Another 600 miles. At caravan speed, likely an additional 2 months. However, travel from Drugger may include interruptions due to raids or wildlife. I frowned. So, 3 months minimum to get to Pict. Correct. That assumes no delays. I nodded, more to myself than to her. 3 months was doable. Painful, but doable. The library became my sanctuary. By day, I maintained appearances, sitting in lectures and keeping my head down. By night, I pored over maps and travelogues, searching for anything that could help me plan my route. Maps of the forest kingdom of Drugger revealed a land thick with towering trees and winding rivers, its people known for their woodcraft and resilience. Caravans frequently crossed the region, and many of them made their way toward Pict, the sprawling capital of Minor Eden. More importantly, Pict was home to a Nexus thread, the lifeline of living mana that tied our planet to the web of worlds above. As well as the seat of the world teleporter, something that could transport people and goods across the Nexus. The thought of standing in its presence sent a thrill down my spine. It wasn't just about running away. This was a chance to start over, to see something greater than the insular world of the Ash Kingdom. The world city of Pict loomed large in Wolfhart's mind as the next great milestone of his escape, a place both promising and daunting in equal measure. Nestled at the heart of Minor Eden, Pict was not just the planet's largest city but its most significant. Hexa's voice filled the quiet of my dorm as I reviewed a map I had borrowed from the Academy library. Pict is the closest thing Minor Eden has to a planetary capital. It's considered neutral ground by all kingdoms, overseen by the Nexus Accord to ensure that no single power controls its resources. Its role as a world city is anchored by the presence of the Nexus thread. I stared at the map, tracing the winding roads that led from the Ash Kingdom to Pict. Neutral ground, I repeated, skepticism thick in his tone. Sounds like a utopia. It is anything but, Hexa replied. While Pict is officially neutral, it is also a concentrated hub of politics, trade, and ambition. It has no king, but the wealth and influence concentrated there rival any monarchy. If Minor Eden has an epicenter of inequality, it is Pict. I frowned, the corners of his mouth twisting in frustration. Rich coming from you, Hexa. You've seen the Ash Kingdom, right? We literally have a king. Half the population doesn't even have basic education, let alone enough to eat. The Ash Kingdom is feudal in its inequality, which is overt and systemic, Hexa said, her tone clinical. Pict's inequality is a more complex structure. It thrives on the illusion of opportunity, drawing people from across Minor Eden with the promise of a better life. But those promises are often hollow. Those who succeed do so at the expense of countless others, and the divide between its wealthy elites and its struggling masses is staggering. I couldn't help but imagine it. I pictured a city as vast as it was vibrant, its streets teeming with people from every corner of Minor Eden. At its heart, the Nexus thread, a pillar of living mana, would rise like a beacon, its radiant blue glow connecting their world to the great web above. But for all its splendor, Pict was a city of contrasts. Lavish estates and towering spires for the privileged, cramped alleyways and endless toil for the rest. So, Washington, D.C.? I asked, mostly joking. Hex's response was immediate. Your comparison to Earth's capital is apt. Like Washington, D.C., Pict serves as a hub for governance and diplomacy. But where D.C. is dominated by national politics, Pict's influence spans worlds. It is a city shaped by its proximity to the Nexus, its wealth derived from the trade and travel it facilitates. And its people? Wolfhart pressed. Pict's population is vast and diverse, drawing individuals from every kingdom on Minor Eden and beyond. You will find humans alongside elves, dwarves, beast folk, and other races. Many come seeking opportunity or refuge, but for most, Pict is a place of struggle, a battleground for survival in a city that values ambition over compassion. Wolfhart leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The vision of Pict forming in his mind was as awe-inspiring as it was intimidating. A city of endless possibilities and crushing realities. A place where power and privilege reigned supreme, but where someone like him, a runaway, a sinner, a void shaper, might slip through the cracks and find a way to survive. It wasn't just the draw of the Nexus thread that pulled him toward Pict. It was the chance to disappear in a city so vast, so chaotic, that no one would notice him, at least for a while. Sounds like the perfect place to get lost, he muttered. I sat on the edge of my bed, counting coins under the dim glow of a magical lamp. My savings were substantial, but far from endless. 50 gold coins, I noted silently. 10 silver. About 40 copper. It was enough to pay for a caravan fee and keep me afloat for 3 months, maybe more if I rationed carefully. Selling some of my more expensive belongings, my enchanted coat, the hoverboard, could stretch that timeline even further. The thought of parting with those things stung, but survival didn't leave much room for sentimentality. Hex's voice cut into my thoughts. Wolfhart, I must point out that while this plan has a high probability of success, there are significant risks. The forest is dangerous, and the world city of Pict is no haven. You may be trading one danger for another. I know, I replied, my voice low. But the capital is a ticking time bomb. Every day I stay, the risks get worse. Hexa didn't respond. 3 days after one Bill's final warning, I returned to my dorm to find the door slightly ajar. The sight sent a cold spike of dread straight to my core. My pulse quickened, and every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. With a trembling hand, I pushed it open, bracing myself for what lay beyond. Chaos. My mattress was slashed, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. My desk drawers had been yanked out, their contents strewn across the floor. Even the floorboards beneath my bed had been pried up, leaving gouges in the wood. Every hiding spot I'd meticulously chosen had been ransacked, exposed for all the world to see. My fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe as I scanned the destruction. My breaths came shallow and fast. The living mana crystal, the one they were looking for, was gone. Not stolen, not misplaced. Gone. It had been consumed, fully absorbed into my body during my evolution 3 days ago, leaving behind nothing but this heavy, oppressive trait of sovereign ascendance that weighed on me like a crown of thorns. The jewel no longer existed, but they didn't know that. They won't stop, Hexa murmured softly, her tone devoid of the usual sarcasm or bite. They think it's still here. I nodded, the movement stiff and jerky. They'll tear the place apart again, I whispered. They'll tear me apart if they find out what really happened. I set to work immediately, my hands trembling as I tried to restore some semblance of order. I flipped my mattress, stacked my overturned drawers, and carefully arranged the torn remnants of my clothes. But it was futile. The room still looked violated, every surface a reminder that my safe haven had been breached. When my roommates returned, their concerned glances only added to the suffocating weight pressing on my chest. I waved them off with a muttered excuse about a clumsy accident, but inside, I was crumbling. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't, not yet. The next day, I began to notice them. At first, it was just a sense, an uncanny feeling that lingered at the edges of my awareness, like shadows shifting in the corner of my vision. But soon, it became undeniable. Strange faces mingled among the usual crowds of students, their eyes tracking my every move. Too rigid. Too focused. They didn't belong. Two on the north end of the hall, Hexa informed me during lunch. Another trailing you through the west wing. Their routes are calculated, staggered. These are professionals. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to take another bite of the bland cafeteria stew. My appetite was non-existent, but I needed the energy. Every step felt like walking a tightrope, my balance precarious. I could feel their eyes on me even now, and my skin prickled with the awareness. Hex's voice returned, quieter this time. You can't keep stalling, Wolfhart. They're closing in. I know, I muttered under my breath. The spoon in my hand trembled as I forced another bite down. But where do I go? What do I do? Anywhere but here, Hexa replied bluntly. That night, I stood at the window of my dorm, staring out at the cityscape of the Ash capital. The sprawling lights of the city glittered like stars, but they brought no comfort. Every glow felt like a watchful eye, every flicker a reminder that my time was running out. The sovereign ascendance trait pulsed faintly within me, a quiet thrum of power I didn't yet understand. It was as if the evolution itself was taunting me, whispering of potential while chaining me to a fate I couldn't escape. I clenched my fists, frustration boiling beneath my skin. I should have known better, I hissed. I should have seen this coming. Regret is a luxury you can't afford, Hexa snapped, her voice sharper than usual. You need to focus on survival, not self-pity. Survival. The word felt hollow. What was I even surviving for? My actions had already cost me the only semblance of friendship I'd ever known. Git and Sona were gone. Ava would never understand. And the academy, this gilded cage, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, and I was woefully unprepared. The following morning, I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had changed. But everything had. My steps were heavier, my mind clouded by the ever-present threat looming over me. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see one Bill's thugs waiting for me. As I crossed the main courtyard, I caught sight of one of the strangers lingering by the fountain. He was pretending to read, but his eyes flicked up as I passed. Our gazes locked for the briefest moment, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew then that time was up. The academy could no longer protect me. The walls that had once felt impenetrable were now nothing more than a facade. If I stayed, it was only a matter of time before they cornered me, and when that happened, I wouldn't survive. That evening, I returned to my dorm to find it in disarray once more. The door hung slightly ajar, the lock twisted and broken. Inside, the mess was worse than before, my belongings scattered, my bed upturned, the window cracked. I froze in the doorway, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. They're escalating, Hexa whispered. This isn't a warning anymore. They're looking for you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My gaze drifted to the sack beneath my coat, the empty sack that had once held the living mana crystal. It was still there, a useless decoy, but it wouldn't fool anyone for long. My hands balled into fists at my sides. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. Time's ticking, I muttered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. And I'm out of options. A week after the ranking matches, I made my move. Under the cover of darkness, I gathered what little I could carry. The academy dorm was silent, the soft snores of my roommates drifting through the thin walls. The sack that had once held the living mana crystal was tucked beneath my coat, empty but still weighted with the memories of what it had contained, and what it had cost me. It had been 3 days since the crystal was consumed during my evolution, but the fear of discovery still gnawed at the edges of my mind. I strapped my hoverboard to my back, laden with the provisions I'd hoarded over the past week. Dried food, water skins, and a few spare clothes, everything I would need to survive the journey ahead. My heart pounded as I slipped out of the dorm, every creak of the floorboards sounding impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. The academy grounds stretched before me, cloaked in shadow. I stuck to the edges, avoiding the main paths where patrols might spot me. My nerves were frayed, every rustle of leaves or distant footsteps setting my pulse racing. Hexa, I whispered, my voice barely audible. You're sure this is the best route? It's the only route, she replied, her tone clipped. You're already a marked target. Staying here is suicide. The gate loomed ahead, its wrought iron bars glowing faintly with enchantments. My palms were slick with sweat as I approached, keeping to the shadows. The guards stationed there looked bored, their attention focused on a card game spread out on a nearby crate. Go now, Hexa urged. Before they notice. I slipped through the narrow gap in the hedge beside the gate, my heart hammering in my chest. Once on the other side, I unstrapped the hoverboard, its familiar hum a small comfort in the suffocating darkness. The streets of the capital were quieter than usual, the oppressive weight of recent events hanging in the air. Word of the stolen coronation jewel had spread like wildfire, and tension simmered beneath the surface of the city. Patrols were more frequent, their lanterns casting shifting shadows on the cobblestone streets. I kept my head down, gliding through the maze of alleys and backstreets. The hoverboard's hum was barely audible, but every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. My thoughts churned with the weight of my decision. I wasn't just leaving the academy, I was abandoning everything I'd built here, however tenuous it had been. By the time I reached the caravan station, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The bustling activity of the station was a stark contrast to the stillness of the night. Merchants shouted orders, laborers loaded crates, and travelers haggled over fares. I slipped into the crowd, just another face among the chaos. As the caravan prepared to depart, I glanced back toward the distant spires of the academy. They shimmered in the morning light, a gilded cage that had once felt like a sanctuary. No more. By the time the sun fully rose over the horizon, Wolfhart Valda Ashdok had disappeared from the capital of Ash. Chapter 30, Rules of Travel. 2 months had passed since Wolfhart left, and the ache of his absence hadn't dulled. Ava sat in their old meeting spot by the river gate, the crumpled letter he'd left behind clutched tightly in her hand. She had read it a dozen times, searching for answers that weren't there. I've gotten into trouble so deep I can't stay in the kingdom anymore. Please don't try to find me. It's safer this way. The words haunted her. She couldn't understand what he was thinking, why he hadn't come to her for help. They had grown up together, shared dreams of seeing the Nexus of Worlds and exploring the unknown. How could he leave without even asking if she wanted to help him? Without even considering that she might want to leave too? They'd grown up together, spent endless nights lying under the stars, talking about what lay beyond the Ash Kingdom. Seeing the Nexus of Worlds had been their dream. And now, he was gone. Tears pricked at her eyes as she stared at the letter. She wasn't just sad. She was angry. Angry that he had shut her out, angry that he hadn't trusted her enough to share his burden. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the letter tighter, her vision blurring with unshed tears. How could he leave like that? Without even a goodbye in person. I would have helped you, she whispered into the empty air, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. But more than anything, she was worried. The weird, nerdy boy she had grown up with, the one who could talk for hours about gravity and mana theory, was gone. In his place was someone she barely recognized. Someone running from something far bigger than himself. 3 days after leaving the capital of Ash. The caravan rumbled eastward toward Drugger, its enchanted wheels bumping along the uneven road. I sat in one of the cushioned seats inside the cabin, a vehicle unlike anything he had ever seen. It was massive, a linked series of 5 cabs with wheels that seemed almost ornamental given their magical propulsion. The structure reminded me of a strange fusion of a shipping truck, a train, and a tank, with the luxury of a cruise ship hidden beneath its armored surface. It was clear why the fare had been so steep. The interior was comfortable, if crowded. Families with children, lone travelers, and a handful of merchants shared the space, all bound for destinations deeper into the forest kingdom of Drugger. The hum of conversation and the occasional clang of shifting cargo filled the air, but my attention kept drifting to the heavily armed guards stationed along the caravan. They had been a constant feature of the last few days. They were an intimidating sight, their weapons polished and their eyes sharp. It wasn't long before curiosity got the better of him. I leaned forward, glancing at the young man seated across from me. The scruffy figure looked to be in his early 20s, his hardy appearance suggesting a lifespan on the road. "Why so many guards?" I asked tentatively. The young man scoffed, barely cracking an eye open. "Seriously?" he muttered, his tone incredulous. Before I could respond, the older man sitting beside the younger one chuckled and leaned in, his grizzled features softening slightly. "Judging by your clothes, boy, I'd wager you've never left the walls of a city before." I stiffened but said nothing. "You look like a little prince to me," the man added with a smirk. "But I'll answer your question anyway." The older man straightened in his seat, gesturing out the window toward the forested horizon. "Raids don't just happen to cities. They happen to travelers, too. Anyone out here for longer than a week is fair game. That's why we've got guards. If your crew's big enough, you'll get hit night one. And let me tell you, boy, that's a lesson you don't want to learn the hard way." "Raids?" I asked, his brows furrowing. The older man nodded. "Portals spawn across the Nexus all the time. Monsters, raiders, and worse wander through. Some of them even seek out the portals looking for trouble. I've even heard some races and tribes covet them as a religious experience, and either way, once they're here, they'll hunt down anything that moves. Doesn't matter if it's a caravan, a lone traveler, or a city, it's all the same to them. My stomach turned at the thought. What happens if you get caught in a raid? The older man's eyes darkened. If you're lucky, you survive. If you're not, well, let's just say the God's Hall of Matchmakings isn't always fair. At the mention of the hall, Wolfhart perked up. He'd heard of it before, but the Academy's lessons had been vague. What's the Hall of Matchmakings? The man chuckled again, though there was no humor in it this time. You really are green, aren't you? The hall is where the gods match attackers and defenders. It's how they keep things balanced. When you're caught in a raid, you're not just fighting random monsters, you're fighting a force that's been deemed your equal. It's also the only place you can use favor. My thoughts raced. And? Favor? What is that? The older man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. Favor's the god's currency. You earn it in the hall by surviving, by fighting, by winning. It's not just for bragging rights, either. Favor can buy you things, legendary weapons, rare skills, even profile changes. My breath caught. Profile changes? The implications were staggering. Don't get any ideas, boy, the man warned, his voice dropping to a low rumble. Favor's not easy to come by, and the hall doesn't care if you're ready or not. If you get matched, you fight, or you die. The younger man beside him stirred, groaning as he shifted in his seat. Trevor, stop scaring the kid, he muttered, his voice thick with sleep. Trevor laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. Don't mind Heinrich. He's just cranky when he doesn't get his beauty sleep. I managed a weak smile, but my mind was still reeling. The hall, the raids, the favor, it was a stark reminder of just how far I was from what I understood. The caravan bumped along the uneven road, the massive wheels kicking up dust as they pressed deeper into the wilderness. Night was falling, and with it came the shadows of a world I barely comprehended. The caravan ride turned out to be an endurance test of patience. The first 6 days blurred together, an endless rhythm of wheels rumbling over uneven roads, the occasional jostle of luggage, and the hum of the caravan's enchantments. I quickly learned that the excitement of travel wore off fast when all you had to look at were the same sprawling forests and dirt paths. Trevor proved to be a surprisingly decent companion. When I could catch him in the mood, he'd regale me with stories about his years on the road, tales of narrow escapes from raiders, the strange creatures he'd seen, and the odd jobs that had carried him across Minor Eden. Heinrich, on the other hand, was a man of few words, content to nap or gaze out the window with a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto his face. Occasionally, Trevor would poke him awake to chide him for being rude, but their dynamic was more amusing than tense. As for me, I split my time between making awkward small talk and battling boredom. The caravan's interior wasn't exactly designed for entertainment. Sure, it was comfortable enough, but there was only so much staring out the window or rereading maps that I could handle before my mind started to wander. That's when Hexa came to the rescue. Let me guess, she said dryly on the 5th afternoon. You're thinking, I'd give anything for some kind of distraction right now. Guilty, I muttered under my breath, careful not to draw attention to myself. Well, as you know, I have a library of interactive simulations. Think of them as mental exercises. She paused. Or games, if you prefer. The offer was too tempting to resist. Hexa loaded a basic version of something resembling Pong, the simple arcade game. It projected in my mind's eye like a floating screen, and I controlled the paddles by subtly moving my hands. Or at least, I tried to be subtle. What the hell are you doing, kid? Trevor asked the first time he caught me swiping at the air. I froze, realizing how strange I must have looked. Stretching? I said weakly, earning a dubious look from him and a smirk from Heinrich, who for once looked amused. After that, I tried to be more discreet, but it wasn't easy. The games helped pass the time, though, and Hexa even got creative, introducing more complex simulations as the days dragged on. Still, even with her help, the monotony of travel gnawed at me. By the time the 7th night rolled around, I was worn thin by the tedium. The caravan had settled into its evening routine, the guards taking up their posts as the passengers prepared to sleep. The air inside the cab was stifling, a mix of body heat and the faint smell of dried food and damp clothes. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a deep, inky blue. Outside, the sounds of nocturnal wildlife began to stir, chirps, rustles, and the occasional distant howl. I leaned back in my seat, my hood pulled low over my face. Trevor was snoring softly in the corner, and Heinrich was idly sharpening a knife, his expression unreadable. For once, the rumble of the caravan's wheels seemed quieter, the rhythm almost lulling me to sleep. Then Hex's voice broke through the silence. "Mild subsonic noise detected," she said, her tone sharper than usual. "Your senses indicate some form of power discharge nearby." I sat up straighter, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, a power discharge?" I whispered, careful not to wake the others. "Uncertain," she replied. "But it's close. Less than a kilometer. The sound patterns and energy fluctuations are consistent with combat." The word sent a chill down my spine. My hand instinctively moved to my coat, fingers brushing against the hidden compartment where I kept my remaining coins and my identify ring. The caravan rumbled on, its pace unchanged. But now, every bump and jostle felt ominous, every shadow outside the window a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that the end of the week wasn't just a coincidence. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to wait for an invitation. Chapter 31, Lessons in Blood. The goosebumps Hex's words had triggered hadn't faded when the first impact hit. A deafening crash reverberated through the caravan, followed by the unmistakable vibrations of magic slamming into its armored exterior. Screams of alarm erupted from the passengers, and I gripped the edge of my seat, heart hammering. "Subsonic discharges still detected," Hexa informed me, her tone as cold and clinical as ever. "They're rapid, clustered." The caravan lurched again, jarring everyone against their seats. The heavy thud of boots hitting the floor echoed through the cab as the guards who had been stationed inside rushed toward the fray. Through the narrow window, I caught glimpses of chaos, flashing lights, sprays of dirt, and figures moving at terrifying speeds. Trevor and Heinrich were both peering out the window, their faces lit by the flickering light of spells and flaming arrows. Trevor let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "These bastards have ogres," he muttered, more annoyed than afraid. "That's not what you want to see on your first raid of a trip." Heinrich, usually quiet, grimaced but said nothing. Outside, the guards engaged the enemy, their voices a mix of commands and battle cries. Bows thrummed as arrows flew, and the harsh clash of steel meeting flesh echoed through the night. Trevor pointed at the chaotic scene. "Look there, boy. See those robed ones? That's not some random band of monsters, they're zealots." "Zealots?" I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. Trevor's face twisted into a grimace. "Fanatics. Religious types. They don't just raid for loot or fun, they fight for the gods' favor. They'll keep coming until they're dead or the gods pull them back to the Hall of Matchmakings." The guards were holding their ground, aided by the caravan's defenses, mounted traps that spewed flames and barbs, cutting down waves of goblins before they could get close. But the sheer numbers of the attackers were staggering. For every goblin that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The ogres were the worst. Massive and relentless, they lumbered forward despite the hail of arrows and spears aimed at them. Their skin, thick and mottled, turned aside some of the blows, and the collars around their necks glowed faintly, pulsing with some unseen magic. They didn't roar or bellow like I expected, instead, they moved with a terrifying, silent purpose, their rage evident only in the destruction they left in their wake. 2 of them reached the caravan, their massive fists smashing into the outer defenses. I flinched as one guard was sent flying, his body crumpling as he hit the ground. The remaining defenders redoubled their efforts, cutting down the ogres with relentless precision. Even so, the damage they caused was enough to create openings for the goblins and orcs to climb aboard. Trevor cursed under his breath as one of the goblins scurried up the side of the caravan. It was grotesque, its green skin glistening under the flickering light of flames. Its oily, tattered uniform was marked with crude runes and jagged stitching, giving it a feral, war-torn appearance. "First time seeing one, boy?" Trevor asked, his voice grim. "You won't forget it." I didn't answer. The goblin leapt forward, knife in hand, only to be skewered midair by a spear thrown by one of the guards. It dissolved into smoke as it hit the ground, leaving only its weapon behind. Hex's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Battlefield analysis, the defenders are gaining the upper hand. Estimated resolution, imminent." I let out a shaky breath. Relief was short-lived. A deafening shatter of magic broke the air. The barrier that protected the passengers dissolved in a swirl of smoke and light. Before anyone could react, an orc barreled through the opening, its massive frame filling the narrow passage. Its eyes gleamed with savage glee as it took in the unarmed humans before it. The passengers screamed, scrambling away from the hulking figure. I froze, my body refusing to move. The orc raised its weapon, a jagged axe dripping with some vile substance, and stepped forward, ready to strike. Trevor moved first. A sword I hadn't noticed before was in his hand, its blade gleaming as it met the orc's axe. The clash sent sparks flying, and Trevor barked out a command. Everyone back. Stay behind me. The duel was brutal. Trevor moved with surprising agility for his age, deflecting the orc's strikes and countering with precise blows. But the orc was relentless, its strength overwhelming. One heavy kick to Trevor's chest sent him sprawling against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Trevor," I shouted, my voice breaking. The older man gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, his sword trembling in his hand. With a sudden burst of speed, he dodged the orc's next swing and slashed downward, severing its hand at the wrist. The orc howled, its blood spraying across the floor. Then something strange happened. A glowing sigil appeared above the orc's head, pulsing with an eerie light. The orc stepped back, clutching its bleeding stump, and smiled, a twisted, knowing expression that sent a chill through me. It pointed its bleeding stump where a hand used to be at Trevor, as if marking him, before dissolving into smoke and vanishing. Trevor collapsed to his knees, his sword clattering to the floor. He let out a shaky laugh, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "Thank the gods," he muttered. "That was just a bluff." The sounds of battle outside faded. The guards had pushed back the attackers, their combined efforts enough to send the survivors to the Hall of Matchmakings, as Trevor had said. The caravan was eerily quiet in the aftermath. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat and blood, the occasional crackle of fading magic traps breaking the stillness. Guards moved methodically through the carnage, retrieving weapons, dragging away bodies, both human and otherwise, and dousing smoldering flames along the caravan's exterior. It was all so routine, as if this chaos was just another day for them. For me, it was anything but. I sat frozen in my seat, my face pale, my hands clenched tightly around the edges of the bench. My mind churned with the image of the orc, its thick gray skin, mottled with scars, its jagged weapon dripping with something vile, its eyes alight with cruel glee. The memory of its warped smile burned in my mind. My stomach churned, and I swallowed hard, forcing back the bile rising in my throat. Why hadn't I done anything? Why hadn't I used the identification ring? The thought struck me like a blow, the realization sharp and bitter. I could have learned something, anything, about it, but I had frozen. My mind had been consumed by fear, by the overwhelming presence of the orc and the malice it carried. "Kid," Trevor's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. I looked up to see him watching me, his face still pale from his own ordeal but steady. He gestured to the blood-soaked floor where the orc had stood moments before. "You're not the first to look like that after a raid. Won't be the last." I forced a shaky breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "The way it smiled," I said quietly. It wasn't just attacking us. It was happy to see us." Trevor nodded grimly, leaning back against the wall. His sword, still slick with dark blood, rested across his lap. "That's because it was farming us for favor." "Favor?" I asked, the word sharp in my memory from our earlier conversations. "Like the gods' favor?" Trevor gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Exactly. The gods reward blood, kid. Every kill in a raid counts toward their tally. That orc saw us, unarmed, untrained, and it saw an easy meal. Easy points." My stomach turned again, but this time it wasn't just from fear. It was disgust. Points? Like a game? The idea was nauseating, yet uncomfortably familiar, a cruel echo of the MMO systems I had loved in my past life. "It's not just a game to them," Trevor said, his voice low. "For the zealots, the favor of the gods is everything. It's what gets them stronger, earns them better skills, better gear. It's their whole reason for living." The words hit me hard, settling into the pit of my stomach like a stone. I thought back to the orc's twisted smile, to the way it had seemed almost delighted as it raised its weapon against Trevor. It wasn't just fighting for survival. It was hunting for sport, for power. Trevor must have noticed the look on my face because he leaned forward, his tone softening slightly. "Listen, kid. That wasn't your first raid, wasn't it?" Shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "Then let me give you some advice. Don't waste time beating yourself up over what you didn't do. Surviving a raid is an accomplishment in itself. Use it. Learn from it. Next time, you'll be ready." I wanted to believe him. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I would ever feel ready. Not for this. The rest of the caravan seemed to pick itself up with an efficiency that only came from experience. The passengers whispered among themselves, casting wary glances at the guards as they worked. Some were pale and shaken, others oddly calm, as if this was just another bump in the road. Even the guards, despite their losses, moved with the practiced ease of people who had seen this all before. I couldn't stop replaying the fight in my mind, the clash of steel, the flash of magic, the guttural screams of goblins and orcs alike. And the orc's sigil, the glowing mark that had appeared before it vanished into smoke. What did it mean? What would have happened if Trevor hadn't been there? Hex's voice pulled me from my thoughts. The orc's behavior aligns with observed raid mechanics. Favor-based raiders often target defenseless individuals to maximize gains. However, the sigil and disappearance suggest additional conditions that warrant further analysis. Yeah, I muttered under my breath. Great. I'll just add orc sigils to the list of things I don't understand. Trevor's laugh startled me. I hadn't realized I'd spoken loud enough for him to hear. Welcome to the real world, kid, he said, his voice tinged with dark amusement. Where the gods keep the rules just clear enough to make sure we don't all die of confusion. I managed a weak smile, though it felt hollow. The real world, huh? It felt more like a nightmare, a world where survival meant navigating a system as brutal as it was inscrutable. Where even monsters fought not just for survival, but for something far more calculated. As the caravan began to move again, the rhythmic hum of its enchanted wheels returned, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. I leaned back in my seat, trying to steady my breathing, but the tension in my chest refused to ease. Trevor glanced at me one last time before closing his eyes, his face still pale but calm. Get some rest, boy. You'll need it. I nodded, though sleep felt impossible. As the caravan rumbled on into the night, I stared out the window, the dark forest stretching endlessly beyond the glass. My reflection stared back at me, pale and haunted. A week after the first raid, the caravan felt more alive, or perhaps more restless. Every creak of the cabin and murmur from the guards seemed louder. Travelers shifted uneasily in their seats, their gazes darting toward the windows as if expecting an attack at any moment. The atmosphere wasn't outright panic, but it was a palpable tension that had settled into the bones of everyone aboard. Wolfhart leaned back against the cabin wall, watching Heinrich fiddle with his knife in silent concentration while Trevor hummed an old tune, seemingly unaffected by the unease around him. Heavy day, Trevor remarked offhandedly, catching my glance. You think we'll get hit again? I asked, though the answer felt obvious. Trevor just smirked, but it was Heinrich who spoke up, his voice low and gruff. It's been quiet too long. Feels like something's coming. Hex's voice broke in from the back of my mind, crisp and clinical. Based on the established raid patterns on this trip so far, the probability of an attack within the next 24 hours is 78.3%. However, these patterns can be irregular and influenced by external factors. How much longer until we reach the border? I whispered, not wanting to draw attention. At the caravan's current speed, approximately 2 days, Hexa replied. We are approaching the border region between the Ash Kingdom and the Forest Kingdom of Drugger. Politically they are rivals and expect a large presence at the border. I frowned, processing the information. The Ash Kingdom and Drugger were infamous rivals, with tensions simmering just below the surface for decades. It was no surprise that the border would be heavily patrolled and even more heavily contested. The caravan wasn't helping matters by choosing defense over speed. While the reinforced cabs and enchanted barriers were impressive, their slow progress made the journey feel agonizingly drawn out. The added protection came at a price, both in terms of time and in the constant sense of vulnerability. Hexa, this feels like it's dragging on forever, I muttered under my breath. The caravan's pace is deliberate, Hexa responded. Its size and defensive capabilities make it a target, but they also ensure survival for extended trips. Additionally, the guards' experience and the provisions provided to passengers are substantial benefits. I had to admit, the food, while far from gourmet, had been a godsend for stretching my own rations. Each meal of preserved meats and hard bread felt like a small victory in maintaining my dwindling supplies. Still, the slow pace grated on my nerves. Over the past week, Hexa and I had debated the merits and risks of raiding. The Hall of Matchmakings fascinated me as much as it terrified me. The favor system, the potential for power, and even that strange sigil the orc had worn, it all called to the greedy, gamer-obsessed part of me that had never quite disappeared. Becoming a raider isn't practical, Hexa had said more than once during our discussions. The risks outweigh the rewards, and the stigma attached to such a path would jeopardize your long-term survival. But I couldn't shake the allure. The thought of walking into the Hall of Matchmakings, armed with my evolving skills and sovereign ascendance, was intoxicating. The gods had created a system where strength was currency, And if I played it right, I could climb the ladder faster than anyone. The morning passed uneventfully, though the tension didn't abate. By midday, the first signs of a raid appeared on the horizon, a ripple in the air, like heat waves distorting the trees in the distance. The heat wave was accompanied by Hex's familiar chime subsonic signature detected. The guards immediately sprang into action, their movements precise and efficient. Trevor and Heinrich watched from the window, their expressions a mix of anticipation and caution. "Looks like we're up," Trevor said, cracking a grin. I peered out the window, my stomach tightening at the sight. This time, the attackers weren't as coordinated as the group from the first raid. Goblins poured from the tree line in chaotic waves, flashes of a blue light marking their arrival, some wielding crude weapons, others unarmed. "Coming-of-age ritual," Trevor muttered, shaking his head. I turned to him, confused. "What?" "Goblins," he said, gesturing toward the attackers. "Big tribes force the young ones into trial by combat. If they survive and earn enough favor, they get a status boost back in their society. Happens more often than you'd think." I stared at the scene outside, my hands gripping the windowsill tightly. The goblins moved with an almost frantic energy, their small forms darting across the battlefield as the caravan's guards met them with arrows and spells. Despite their numbers, the goblins seemed less of a threat this time. "They're scared," I said, almost to myself. "Not scared," Trevor corrected. "Determined. They're here to prove themselves, but they don't want to die doing it. Can't blame them for that." The guards made quick work of the raid, their experience and superior equipment tipping the scales decisively. A few of the goblins managed to get close to the caravan, but the enchanted traps, flame emitters and barriers, dispatched them before they could do any real damage. The survivors disappeared into the same wispy smoke as before, their failure marked by the gods' intervention. "Efficient," Hexa noted. "Minimal losses on the guard's side. No passengers endangered." I nodded, though my mind lingered on the goblins. They weren't mindless monsters, they were individuals, fighting for a chance at something greater. It was a sobering thought, one that made the stark realities of this world feel even heavier. Time passes, and as the caravan rolled on, the towering trees of the forest kingdom of Drugger came into view. Their dark, sprawling canopies loomed like sentinels, casting long shadows over the road ahead. In the distance, a cluster of lights flickered, a border town nestled against the edge of the forest. Hex's voice cut through my thoughts. "Analysis suggests the lights belong to an informal settlement surrounding the border outpost. These towns often form when individuals seek proximity to guard camps for protection, despite the inherent risks of the region." I squinted, taking in the ramshackle buildings that clung to the edges of the outpost's walls. They weren't quite tents, but they weren't permanent structures either. The construction was haphazard, the materials mismatched. It was as if the residents expected their homes to be destroyed at any moment. "A shanty town," I murmured. "Correct. Such settlements are not uncommon in contested regions on Earth," Hexa replied. "Their existence often complicates border security there, and worse here as they likely attract raids and other forms of aggression." As we drew closer, the lights grew brighter, illuminating the stark contrast between the sturdy walls of the outpost and the fragile homes beyond them. The sight left me uneasy, a reminder of just how precarious life could be in this world. The caravan slowed as we approached the outskirts of the town, its massive wheels crunching over the uneven road. Chapter 32, A Kingdom's Border. The caravan jolted to a halt, and the magical intercom buzzed to life, its tinny voice cutting through the din of settling passengers. "We'll be stopping here for inspection," the caravan master announced. "This will take some time, so feel free to stretch your legs. But stay close, we'll depart as soon as clearance is granted." The cabin erupted into murmurs as people began gathering their things. I felt the collective relief of cramped bodies eager to move. Trevor and Heinrich exchanged a knowing glance before heading for the exit without a word. Hex's voice chimed softly in my mind. "Trevor is displaying elevated stress signals. Observe closely." Curious, I followed the two out into the bustling chaos of the border town. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, mingled with the faint, acrid scent of sweat and desperation. The shanty-like structures clung to the edges of the guard post, their mismatched construction creating an uneven skyline of makeshift homes and stalls. People moved with purpose, but their faces were drawn, wary. Trevor's shoulders were unusually tense as he scanned the surroundings. I hesitated before stepping closer, keeping my tone light. "Why so on edge, Trevor?" He jumped slightly and turned, glaring at me. "Brat, don't sneak up on people like that. Ain't polite." His words were gruff, but there was no real anger behind them. He sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. Look, kid, don't go prying where you shouldn't. I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. You're obviously worried about something. Trevor huffed, his lips pressing into a thin line before he finally gave in. Fine. You see those guards? He nodded toward the post's walls, where soldiers stood at full attention, their eyes sharp and weapons ready. The air around them seemed charged, as if they were waiting for something to happen. They're acting like the gods themselves are about to come stomping through here, Trevor continued. My bet is they haven't been raided recently. That makes them a target, and us being here complicates things. More people gathered means a bigger ranking in the halls for any raiders groups looking to earn favor. I glanced at the guards, their presence radiating barely contained tension. It wasn't just the soldiers. The entire settlement seemed to be holding its breath, the weight of the potential raid pressing down on everyone. The sprawling border town was nothing like the capital of Ash, and even less like Valda Ashdok. The ramshackle buildings and bustling streets mirrored something closer to the chaotic energy of the Festival of Sin, a far cry from the structured order I'd once considered normal. Trevor and Heinrich moved purposefully through the mud-slick streets, weaving through the crowds. I trailed behind them, sidestepping merchants hawking wares and children darting between legs. The air buzzed with the sound of raised voices, clanging pots, and the occasional bark of a dog. Trevor glanced back, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Didn't think you'd keep up, he muttered, but his tone was approving. We came to a halt outside the largest building in the area, a saloon-like structure with a weathered sign swinging from rusted chains. The faint sound of music and laughter drifted out, muffled by the heavy doors. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of ale and sweat. The place was quieter than I expected, the usual raucous energy of such establishments dampened by the absence of off-duty guards. The few patrons scattered about seemed subdued, their conversations low. As we took a seat near the corner, something caught my eye. Among the serving staff weaving between tables were several women with distinctly inhuman features, ears, tails, and other traits that marked them as beast folk. Their appearances were striking, their movements fluid and captivating in a way that drew attention. I felt my face flush as I looked away quickly, trying to focus on anything else. My thoughts betrayed me, unbidden memories of late nights on Earth surfacing, the kind I wasn't proud of. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to steady my breathing. Trevor's laugh broke through my awkward attempt at composure. Relax, kid, he said, smirking. Ain't the first time someone's gotten caught staring. Beast folk have that effect, especially on your type. My type? I snapped, my embarrassment flaring into irritation. Trevor leaned back in his chair, grinning. City boys. You're not used to seeing anything beyond your walls. Guessing this is your first time outside the Ash Kingdom, huh? I didn't dignify that with a response, opting instead to glare at the worn wood of the table. Heinrich chuckled quietly, his usual scowl softening into something almost amused. The conversation shifted as Trevor flagged down a passing waitress, ordering drinks and food. As we waited, Trevor's gaze wandered toward the windows, his jovial demeanor dimming slightly. Let's hope we can avoid the worst, he muttered. This place doesn't need a raid right now. Not with all these people around. Makes it harder for the guards, too. The Hall of Matchmakings isn't kind to situations like this. I frowned. What do you mean? Trevor shrugged, his expression grim. Raids aren't just about numbers. The gods don't care if you're outnumbered or outmatched, they care about balance. The more people here, the more complicated the raid gets. And if we're unlucky, they might decide to even the odds by throwing something nasty our way. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in my chest. The thought of another raid, especially one worse than the last, made my stomach churn. Trevor's eyes met mine, his gaze steady. Stay sharp, kid, he said. The gods play by their own rules. And they don't care if you're ready for them. By the time night fell, the tension that had hung over the day like a fog was replaced with the ominous promise of rain. Heavy clouds rolled in from the east, their dark forms lit occasionally by flashes of distant lightning. The wind picked up, tugging at the loosely constructed buildings of the shanty town and sending the few stragglers scurrying for cover. The storm wasn't part of anyone's plans, and it drove most of the inhabitants indoors. The air in the tavern grew warmer and heavier, the scent of damp clothes and wood smoke mixing with the aromas of food and ale. Rain drummed against the roof, muffling the murmur of conversation inside. At our table, Trevor and Heinrich had settled into their seats like they belonged there, ordering drinks with an ease that spoke of years of practice. A young beast folk waitress with cat ears and a bushy, swishing tail took their orders, her appearance drawing more attention than the two men seemed to notice, or care about. Her large amber eyes gleamed in the low light, and her demeanor was sweet and playful, clearly part of her charm for the patrons. I found myself avoiding her gaze, my cheeks burning as I tried to focus on anything else. My thoughts betrayed me, unbidden memories surfacing that only made my embarrassment worse. It didn't help that Trevor smirked knowingly at me. The waitress returned with their drinks, setting the mugs down with a practiced flourish. I reached for a menu, trying to change the unspoken subject and make myself useful. Spotting the list of meals, I glanced at Trevor. "I'll just order something light," I began, but Trevor cut me off. "Not so fast," he said, wagging a finger at me. "Kid like you doesn't need ale dulling his brain or stunning his growth. Trust me, Heinrich here's proof of that." Heinrich, already nursing his mug, grunted but didn't argue. Trevor turned back to the waitress. "Get him a stew. And make it hearty, he looks like he needs a proper meal." The waitress nodded, smiling warmly before disappearing back to the kitchen. I didn't argue, though I felt a twinge of irritation at being treated like a child. When the food arrived, though, my annoyance faded. The stew was steaming and fragrant, served with a chunk of crusty bread. I dipped a spoon in, lifting a bit of the thin but rich broth to my lips. The flavors were simple but satisfying, the kind of meal that felt like it belonged in a proper fantasy world. The meat, whatever it was tender enough, and the bread soaked up the broth perfectly. I found myself enjoying it more than I expected, letting the warmth of the meal chase away the lingering unease from earlier in the day. Meanwhile, Trevor and Heinrich settled into their drinks. The older man paced himself, sipping and chatting easily, while Heinrich downed his ale with more enthusiasm. As the evening wore on and the alcohol flowed, their guardedness began to slip away, replaced by a relaxed camaraderie that revealed more than I'd heard from them in the entire week prior. "So, kid," Trevor began, his voice carrying a slight slur. "Bet you're wonderin' what brings two fine gentlemen like us to a dump like this." I shrugged, not wanting to pry but curious nonetheless. "You said you're heading to Pict. What for?" Trevor leaned back, tipping his chair at a precarious angle. "Work. The kind you don't talk about in polite company. Used to be part of a raiding group, Heinrich here and his old man included. We'd take contracts from towns, cities, even private groups. Go on the offensive, you know? Hit raids before they hit us. Or sometimes. Just for favor." "Favor?" I echoed, glancing at Heinrich, who was now staring into his mug. Trevor nodded, his expression darkening slightly. "Yeah. You'd be surprised how much cities'll pay to bump their favor with the gods. Higher favor means better ambient mana density, more resources, better protection. It's a numbers game, kid. And we were good at it, until we weren't." He sighed, taking a longer sip of his drink before continuing. "Last job went south. Just bad luck all around. Lost half the group. Heinrich's old man lost a leg. He's holed up in a little village now, but we're making our way to Pick to sign on with a company. They'll set us up with portal hunting parties, and give us real work again. The pay's good, and if we play our cards right, we'll make enough to get Heinrich's dad a new start." I looked at Heinrich, whose jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the table. "Why not stay in the Ash Kingdom?" I asked hesitantly. "Wouldn't it be easier?" "Easier doesn't cut it," Heinrich interrupted, his voice low but firm. "We need money. Real money. And the Hall of Matchmakings is where we'll find it." Hexa chimed in quietly, her voice laced with a hint of exasperation. "If you'd paid attention to your lectures, especially about the church, you'd know this already. Favor is a key metric for cities and individuals alike, influencing everything from mana distribution to social standing. Raiding, when offensive, is the main source of favor." I frowned, absorbing the information. The idea of entire towns paying for raids to improve their mana density felt both fascinating and unsettling. It was a system that rewarded violence and survival. As the night wore on, the conversation turned lighter, the two men sharing stories of their past adventures and close calls. Trevor's laughter was infectious, and even Heinrich cracked a few wry smiles. For a moment, it was easy to forget the tension that hung over the border town, the storm outside drowning out the exterior world. Chapter 33, a series of unfortunate events. The peace of the border tavern shattered with a loud, blaring alarm. My heart sank as Hex's voice rang in my mind, clipped and efficient. Subsonic signatures detected. Probability of raid initiation, 92%. Your senses are maxed in this storm, but I strongly advise immediate retreat. Before I could fully process her words, Trevor and Heinrich were already on their feet, throwing a handful of coins onto the table. Some scattered to the floor, but neither cared. Trevor grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "Come on, boy," he barked. "Back to the caravan, now." That coward of a caravan master will bolt the second he smells trouble. Probably already on the move. His voice rose above the pounding rain as we rushed for the door. The storm outside was merciless, rain hammering down in heavy sheets that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The chaotic scene of the shanty town unfolded in flashes of lightning, people scrambling to secure makeshift doors, dragging valuables indoors, or simply running in the storm with no real destination. A surge of panic rippled through the air, raw and palpable. Trevor's voice cut through the storm as he led the charge. The caravan's gonna leave us behind if we don't move, and I'm not about to be stuck in this hellhole. Keep up, boy. The mud sucked at my boots with every step, slowing me down as I struggled to match Trevor's pace. Even Heinrich, usually sullen and silent, moved with a sense of urgency that I hadn't seen before. They were both clearly seasoned at this, running in bad conditions, keeping a low profile in chaotic environments. Me? I felt like a fish out of water, flailing as the storm did its best to drag me down. Hex's voice chimed in again, calm but insistent. Caravan detected approximately 800 meters ahead. Current speed indicates it's moving just faster than a walking pace. If you maintain your current velocity. I know, I snapped, my words barely audible over the rain. Just keep me updated. Trevor's voice shouted over his shoulder as we reached the edge of the shanty town. Keep those legs moving, kid. Don't let the mud get the better of you. The caravan was visible in the distance, its massive form lumbering through the forest, illuminated sporadically by flashes of lightning. Its enchanted wheels churned through the muddy path with ease, moving just fast enough to stay ahead of us. My chest burned as I pushed harder, my feet slipping and sliding in the muck. Fucking coward is gonna make me run, Trevor growled, his voice laced with frustration as he pumped his arms, refusing to slow down. We followed in the caravan's tracks, the deep ruts in the mud making the path treacherous but also providing a clear route forward. The pounding rain seemed to intensify, turning the trail into a quagmire. Every step felt like a battle against the elements. Hexa chimed in again. Additional subsonic signatures detected. Movement suggests hostile entities converging on your position. I barely had time to register her warning when a deafening roar echoed through the storm. My head whipped around, my eyes scanning the darkened forest. The sound came from somewhere behind us, a guttural, primal noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then I saw it, if only for a moment. A massive silhouette barreled over a hill and into the shanty town, its enormous frame illuminated briefly by a crack of lightning. It was gorilla-like, its limbs thick and powerful, its movements unnervingly fluid for something so large. My stomach churned at the sight, dread pooling in my gut. Keep running, Trevor shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. Don't stop, no matter what. As we pushed forward, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Shapes flitted through the rain, their figures lean and bird-like. At first, I thought they might be some kind of beast-man, but as they drew closer, their features became clearer, and far more unsettling. They moved with an unnatural grace, their feathers slick and darkened by the rain. Their eyes glowed faintly, sharp and predatory, as they zeroed in on us. Skeksis-looking bastards. I muttered, panic setting in as I realized they were gaining on us. Their lean, avian forms made them fast, and their long, talon legs tore through the mud with ease. Trevor turned his head, his face grim as he registered the new threat. They think we're easy favor, he shouted. Don't let 'em catch you, lads. Run faster. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. But it wasn't enough. One of the bird creatures lashed out with something, ropes? No, fibers. Ebolas, spiked and wickedly sharp, whipped through the air and tangled around my legs. The force of the hit sent me sprawling face first into the mud. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, and I tasted dirt and rainwater as I struggled to push myself up. Kid. I heard Trevor yell, but I couldn't see him through the rain and mud obscuring my vision. I clawed at the bolas, its spiked ends biting into my skin as I tried to free myself. My profile flickered in my mind, showing a small but noticeable drop in my HP. Blood seeped from where the spikes had embedded in my leg, mixing with the mud. Panic surged as I realized I didn't have anything sharp to cut the ropes. I instead clear my eyes and look around. Through the haze of rain and pain, I made out the forms of Trevor and Heinrich. They stood back to back, their weapons drawn as the bird creatures closed in. The clash of steel and talons was brutal, the two men moving with practiced coordination. Heinrich, despite his gruff demeanor, fought with surprising precision, his blade flashing in the dim light. Trevor, meanwhile, wielded his sword with a brutal efficiency that spoke of years of experience. One of the bird creatures fell almost immediately, its body dissolving into the familiar wisp of smoke that marked its return to the gods. The remaining 3 circled warily, their glowing eyes locked on the 2 men. They darted in and out, testing their defenses, but Trevor and Heinrich held their ground. I fumbled with the bolas, my fingers slipping on the wet fibers as I tried to untangle myself. The mud sucked at my movements, making every motion feel sluggish and clumsy. Another bird creature lunged, its talons aimed for Heinrich's exposed side. Trevor intercepted with a well-timed strike, his sword biting deep into the creature's chest. It let out a strangled cry before vanishing in a puff of smoke. The remaining 2 hesitated, their movements more cautious now. But Trevor and Heinrich didn't give them a chance to regroup. With a coordinated flurry of strikes, they dispatched the last of the bird creatures, their bodies vanishing one by one. Trevor turned to me, his chest heaving as he extended a hand. "Get up, kid. We're not done yet." I grasped his hand, wincing as he pulled me to my feet. My leg throbbed where the spikes had dug in, but I managed to stand. The rain around us felt deafening in the absence of the fight, each drop hammering down with relentless intensity. The caravan was now a distant shape in the rain, too far for us to catch on foot. Trevor swore under his breath, his gaze fixed on the retreating form. "Well," he muttered, wiping rain from his face, "guess we're on our own for now." Rain poured in relentless sheets, soaking everything and everyone to the bone as the 3 of us stood in the muddy road. My ankle throbbed from the spiked bolas, and my chest burned from the desperate sprint after the caravan. The faint glow of its enchanted lights was long gone, swallowed by the dark forest and the driving storm. Trevor wiped rain from his face, scowling. "Damn coward of a caravan master. Left us for dead." He looked back toward the faint outline of the shanty town and the guard post in the distance. "We should head back." "What?" Heinrich turned to his uncle, clearly baffled. "You're just gonna let the caravan go?" "We're not catching it on foot, boy," Trevor snapped, though his voice carried more frustration than anger. "We get back to the guard post, find some horses, and we'll be on them in no time. We'll catch up in a day or 2. Maybe less, if we ride hard." Heinrich frowned but didn't argue. Instead, he knelt down and picked something up from the ground near one of the dissipating wisps of smoke. His hand emerged with a faintly glowing object, a small, jagged amulet etched with unfamiliar runes. The storm light gave it an almost otherworldly gleam. "What's that?" I asked, stepping closer despite the mud sucking at my boots. Heinrich turned it over in his hand, rainwater running off its smooth surface. "Loot," he said simply. "Not uncommon after a raid like that, but this." He squinted at the markings, his brows furrowing. "It's got a favor mark on it." I tilted my head. "A favor mark?" Trevor grunted, leaning over to inspect the amulet. "Means it was enchanted in the Hall of Matchmakings. The gods' currency paid for this. Probably not by the bird that dropped it, though. It's a rare find, birds like these don't tend to have the favor for something like this. My guess is, this is a god's blessed item. Rare as hell." I stared at the amulet, the gears in my mind turning. "If it's enchanted, can't we just, I don't know, identify it?" Both men turned to me, eyebrows raised. Trevor laughed first, a short, disbelieving bark. "Identify it? Boy, you planning to whip out a mage and a ritual circle in the middle of this storm? Or maybe he's carrying an appraisal orb in his back pocket," Heinrich added, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the simple band that had been gifted, or rather, thrust upon me, by one bill. I slipped it onto my finger, feeling the slight tingle of its magic activating. Would an identify ring work? The laughter stopped instantly. Both men stared at me as though I'd just sprouted a second head. "Kid," Trevor said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Where in the gods' names did you get one of those?" I hesitated, realizing belatedly how this might look. "It was a gift." Heinrich snorted. "Must have been a damn rich friend." I ignored the comment, focusing instead on the amulet in Heinrich's hand. I reached out, and he reluctantly handed it over. As I held the cool, rain-slick object, the ring on my finger began to glow faintly. A familiar wave of magical text scrolled across my vision, crisp and clinical. Amulet of storage rarity, rare, God's blessed, enchantment, spatial compression details. This amulet contains an internal storage space equivalent to a 30 by 30 by 30 room. Items placed inside are preserved in stasis, unaffected by time or external conditions. Cost to enchant, 250 favor notes. This item was enchanted in the Hall of Matchmakings. God's blessed items are rare loot drops and are often associated with higher tier raids. I blinked, my mind whirring as I processed the information. It's an amulet of storage, I said aloud, my voice barely audible over the rain. It can hold a whole room's worth of stuff in stasis. 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. Heinrich let out a low whistle, leaning closer to peer at the amulet. That's damn rare. A God's blessed item? Expensive, too, Trevor added, his tone impressed despite himself. Most raiders don't have the favor to afford something like that. My guess? That bird didn't enchant it. Heinrich grinned, clearly pleased. This is a good find. Maybe this trip isn't cursed after all. Before I could respond, a familiar, bone-rattling roar ripped through the storm. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the guard post, shaking the trees and sending a flock of hidden birds into frantic flight. Trevor's face darkened instantly. So much for that idea, he muttered. Whatever that thing is, it's tearing the place apart. No way we're getting horses now. The post'll be chaos. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Trevor shook his head. Not from our world, that's for damn sure. Something native to a high mana planet like Terra Prima. I've seen a few of its kind before. Big. Strong. And bad news. Great, I muttered, shivering as the rain continued to pour. So now what? Trevor sighed, his expression grim as he turned to face the forest. Now, we keep moving. Hound's a death trap, the post is worse, and the caravan's long gone. We'll find another way. The roar comes again over the rain. Heinrich nodded, tightening his grip on his sword. Agreed. Let's move. With that, we set off into the storm, the amulet returned safely to Trevor and the roar of the unknown creature echoing in the distance. Chapter 34, Onward Through the Rain. The forest felt endless. Towering trees cast long, shadowy shapes in the dim light of dawn, their thick canopies doing little to keep the persistent rain from soaking through my cloak. The downpour hadn't relented since the night before, and every step through the muddy road seemed to sap the strength from my legs. Trevor led the way, his grizzled face set in determination as he plowed ahead, his boots sinking into the muck with each step. Heinrich followed close behind, silent as ever but showing signs of wear. I brought up the rear, struggling to keep pace. My ankle throbbed where the spiked bolas had cut me, and every step sent a jolt of pain up my leg. My mind drifted, longing for the enchanted interior of the caravan, the dry, cushioned seats, the faint hum of its magical propulsion, and, most importantly, my belongings. You're dragging, boy, Trevor barked over his shoulder, his voice sharp despite the weariness etched into his features. Pick up the pace. I bit back a retort, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. Hexa chimed in softly, her voice a welcome distraction. Your body's current state is suboptimal for prolonged exertion. Muscle fatigue is increasing at a rapid rate, and your stamina reserves are low. Thanks for the pep talk, I muttered under my breath. The rain persisted through the night, a constant drumbeat that seemed to mock my exhaustion. By the time the pale light of morning broke through the forest, my legs felt like lead, and my soaked clothes clung uncomfortably to my skin. Trevor finally called for a brief stop, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. It wasn't long before we spotted it, a small walled settlement nestled at the base of a hill. The sight brought a flicker of hope to my tired heart. It was the first sign of civilization I'd seen since crossing into the forest kingdom of Drugger, and it was far smaller than Valda Ashdok. The walls were sturdy but modest, clearly built to keep out raiders rather than withstand a prolonged siege. As we approached, a gruff voice called out from the top of the gate. Turn around, strangers. We're not taking visitors. Trevor raised a hand, stepping forward. We're not looking for trouble. Just a place to rest and some help catching up with the caravan. The man on the wall, a burly figure with a crossbow slung over his shoulder, spat over the side. I said, move along. We've got nothing for you. Trevor scowled, his patience clearly wearing thin. He opened his mouth to retort when the gates creaked open, revealing an older woman in a plain dress, her posture commanding despite her frailty. She stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning us before settling on Trevor. Enough, Harlan, she said, her tone brisk. If they mean no harm, there's no reason not to be hospitable. Or have you forgotten our ways? The man grumbled under his breath but lowered his crossbow, stepping aside as the woman gestured for us to enter. We exchanged uncertain glances before following her inside. The village was small, its narrow dirt streets lined with modest wooden homes. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and a few curious faces peeked out from windows as we passed. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and the air carried the faint smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Despite its simplicity, the settlement exuded a sense of unity, a place built and maintained by family. The old woman, who introduced herself as Ms. Grubber, led us to a small communal building at the center of the village. Inside, the air was warm and dry, the scent of cooking vegetables wafting from a pot over a crackling fire. "Sit," she instructed, gesturing to a rough-hewn table. "I'll fetch you some soup. It's not much, but it'll warm you up." We sat gratefully, and I let out a sigh of relief as I pulled off my soaked cloak. The wooden bench beneath me felt like heaven after hours of trudging through the rain. Ms. Grubber returned moments later with 3 bowls of steaming vegetable soup. It was simple, watery and sparse, but after the night we'd had, it tasted like a feast. Between spoonfuls, Trevor explained our situation, describing the caravan and our need for 2 horses to catch up. Ms. Grubber listened in silence, her sharp eyes studying us intently. When Trevor finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I understand your plight," she said slowly. "But I'm afraid I can't spare any horses. We were raided just 2 days ago, and we're still recovering. Every able-bodied creature we have is needed here." Trevor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Fair enough. Thank you for the soup, ma'am." We didn't linger. The refusal left a bitter taste in my mouth, but Trevor seemed resigned. As we stepped back out into the rain, he muttered under his breath, "No point wasting time. The next settlement will have to do." The prospect of continuing the trek on no sleep made my stomach sink, but I bit back my complaints. The muddy tracks left by the caravan were still visible, a faint trail winding through the dense forest. Trevor took the lead again, his determined pace unbroken despite the fatigue etched into his features. Hex's voice chimed softly in my mind. "Your physical condition is deteriorating. Continued travel without rest may result in..." Yeah, I get it," I muttered. "Not much of a choice, is there?" The rain continued to fall in relentless sheets, each drop hammering against my resolve. My body ached, my ankle throbbed, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. But as the muddy trail stretched on before us, I forced myself to keep moving. There was no going back. Not now. The rain never stopped. It hammered down in relentless sheets as we trudged through the forest, the muddy caravan tracks our only guide. The weight of the constant downpour was oppressive, soaking through every layer of clothing, chilling us to the bone. The forest's canopy did little to shield us, the leaves overhead dripping with water that pooled and splattered down with every gust of wind. Trevor led the way, his grizzled face set in grim determination. Heinrich followed close behind, silent as ever but visibly drained. I stumbled after them, my ankle screaming in protest with every step. Hex's updates on my physical condition were a constant background noise, her tone clipped and analytical as she listed the growing litany of issues: muscle fatigue, dehydration, minor hypothermia. By mid-afternoon, even Trevor began to slow, pausing occasionally to wipe the rain from his face and scan the horizon. The muddy tracks remained visible, but the trail felt endless, stretching out like a cruel taunt. "We're in a sorry state," Trevor muttered, breaking the heavy silence. "Nothing on us but soaked clothes and empty stomachs. If we don't hit the caravan or a settlement soon, we'll be sleeping out here tonight." The thought made my stomach churn. I glanced at Heinrich, who gave a grim nod but said nothing. None of us wanted to admit it, but Trevor was right, we weren't going to make it anywhere before nightfall. As the gray light of day began to fade, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening with each passing minute. The tracks ahead were barely visible now, obscured by the mud and the encroaching gloom. Trevor finally called for a halt, his voice heavy with frustration. "This is it," he said, gesturing to a small clearing off the trail. "We'll stop here for the night. Ain't much of a choice." We gathered together, our exhaustion outweighing any hesitation. The clearing was little more than a patch of flattened grass surrounded by dense trees, the rain continuing to pour down through the gaps in the canopy. Trevor dropped his pack and began gathering what few branches he could find that weren't entirely soaked through. "Don't bother with a fire," he said gruffly. "We'd never get it lit in this weather, and the light might attract trouble. Just sit tight and keep quiet." Heinrich and I nodded, settling into the clearing's edge. My entire body ached as I sat down, leaning against a tree trunk. The mud squelched beneath me, and I pulled my cloak tighter around myself, though it did little to ward off the chill. Trevor sat nearby, his sword resting across his knees as he scanned the darkened forest. "I'll take first watch," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Listen close, boy. Things in these woods ain't always what they seem. And the gods, well..." He trailed off, his expression hardening. "They might see the 3 of us as a fair target for a solo raider. Rare, but it happens. Someone's always got to keep watch. Always remember that." The weight of his words settled over me like the rain, cold and unrelenting. I shifted uncomfortably, the reality of our situation pressing down on me. The thought of being ambushed in the middle of the night, of facing yet another raid, made my stomach churn. But Trevor's calm, no-nonsense demeanor was oddly reassuring. Heinrich grunted, settling into the mud with surprising ease. "Wake me when it's my turn," he muttered, pulling his cloak over his head. I tried to follow his example, leaning back against the tree and closing my eyes. But sleep felt impossible, the cold and wet seeping into my bones, the sound of the rain filling my ears. Every creak of the forest, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. Trevor's voice broke through the darkness, low and steady. "Rest while you can, boy. You'll need your strength for tomorrow." I nodded, though my eyes remained open, staring up at the rain-soaked canopy above. The forest felt alive around us, its presence heavy and watchful. For the first time, I truly understood what Trevor meant. Out here, the gods played their games, and we were little more than pieces on their board. Chapter 35, Talks. The rain didn't let up, its relentless rhythm blending with the quiet sounds of the forest. Somehow, soaked to the bone and shivering against the tree trunk, I managed to drift off. My dreams were vague and fleeting, images of glowing sigils, smoke wisping into the air, and the haunting smile of that orc with its glowing stump. A firm hand shook me awake. "Your turn, kid," Trevor's gruff voice broke through my haze. My eyes fluttered open to see him crouched over me, rain dripping from his hood. He motioned toward Heinrich, still soundly asleep, curled up a few feet away. "Keep an eye out." I groaned softly, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The cold was sharper now, cutting through me as I adjusted my cloak. The forest around us was still pitch black, the rain muting the usual sounds of the night. Trevor didn't leave, though. He sank down against a nearby tree, his sword balanced across his lap. I frowned, my breath visible in the cold air. "Why are you still awake?" He held up a hand, shushing me sharply. "Don't wake Heinrich. Let him rest." His voice carried an edge of exhaustion, but his sharp eyes remained fixed on the forest. His silence was heavier than the rain, and when he finally spoke, his tone was low and deliberate. "Listen, kid. You've got a lot to learn, or you're not going to last long out here. I've been watching you. You're soft. Too soft to be wandering outside walls without some serious backup." I stiffened, his words striking deeper than I expected. Before I could respond, he pressed on. "Look at you. Your clothes, your gear, even the way you move, screams that you've never had to survive out here before. And that ring of yours? Either you're stupid, or you're hiding something. My guess is the latter." His eyes locked onto mine, their intensity making me feel like a child caught in a lie. "Considering your weird class, that fancy evolution, and those rumors coming out of the capital of Ash, I'd wager you're the second or third prince. Stole your brother's birthright, didn't you?" I blinked, the accusation hitting me like a slap. "What?" My voice was louder than I intended, but Trevor shot me a sharp look, silencing me again. I lowered my voice, glancing nervously at Heinrich, who hadn't stirred. I'm not a prince. I'm just running from death," Trevor interrupted, his tone flat. "I've seen your type before. You've got the look of someone who doesn't belong, trying to blend in but failing miserably. You dress like a commoner, but you don't know how to act like one. That ring? That's not something any normal kid would have. And don't think I haven't noticed how you avoid using it." I felt my stomach twist. His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I considered lying, spinning some story to deflect his suspicions, but his piercing gaze left little room for deception. After a long pause, I sighed, my shoulders slumping. "You're wrong about the prince part," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the rain. "But you're not completely off. I'm running, yeah. From something big." Trevor raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. Reluctantly, I told him everything, or at least, most of it. I recounted the story of how I had acquired the living mana, the heist, the evolution, and won Bill's threats. I left out Hexa and the specifics of my Void Architect class, keeping those details buried deep. When I finished, Trevor leaned back against the tree, letting out a low whistle. "You're not just stupid, kid. You're impressively stupid. Stole living mana? From a crown prince's coronation? And then used it to evolve? By the gods," he chuckled, shaking his head. "I almost gave you credit for being clever. Thought you were hiding something real big, but turns out you're just an idiot." I scowled, heat rising to my face despite the cold. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." He laughed again, his voice tinged with genuine amusement. Lesson number 1, boy, that crime boss didn't give you a ring of identifium metal as a gift. It's a tool. And a damn good one at that. Use it often. People might think it's rude, but most can't even tell you're using it. It's subtle. I hesitated, fidgeting with the ring on my finger. I didn't think. That's obvious, Trevor interrupted. You didn't think. But you should start. I haven't seen that thing glow once since we met. If you'd been using it, you might have learned a thing or two about the people around you. He paused, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Like me. My breath hitched. You've been using one? Trevor smirked. Don't need to. People like me, we've got skills for that. I've seen your profile, boy. Just the basics, but enough to know you're not normal. That evolution of yours? It's rare. And dangerous. Hex's voice echoed in my mind, her tone laced with unease. He's not lying. Evidently some profiles have discernment skills that bypass normal identification methods. He likely saw enough to connect the dots. I swallowed hard, the weight of Trevor's words settling over me. He wasn't just a grizzled wanderer. He was far more dangerous than I'd realized. And he'd been watching me closely, piecing together the puzzle of who I was and what I was hiding. Lesson number 2, Trevor continued, his voice softening slightly. Out here, trust is earned. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't use every advantage you've got. That ring? It's an edge. Use it wisely. And don't make the mistake of thinking you can bluff your way through everything. Sooner or later, someone's going to call you out. He stood, stretching his arms and cracking his neck. Now, get up. Your watch isn't going to stand itself. And keep those ears sharp, boy. The gods aren't kind to those who let their guard down. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as I stood. The rain continued to pour, the forest around us a dark, oppressive void. As Trevor sank back down against the tree, his sword resting once again. The rain continued its relentless assault, soaking us to the bone. The forest kingdom of Drugger lived up to its reputation, lush, dense, and utterly unforgiving. Days of trudging through the muck had left me feeling like a human prune, my hands wrinkled and raw from gripping the edge of my drenched cloak. Trevor and Heinrich weren't faring much better. Their tempers frayed as the days dragged on, and even Trevor's usually steady demeanor began to show cracks. We're chasing ghosts at this point, Heinrich muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. He kicked a rock, sending it splashing into a puddle. Caravan's probably halfway to picked by now. Trevor shot him a sharp glare but said nothing. His determination was palpable, driving us forward despite the miserable conditions. I wanted to complain, to sink into the misery that weighed on us like the rain-soaked air, but something in Trevor's unrelenting march kept me moving. Even Hexa had fallen unusually silent, her usual commentary absent as though the storm dampened her as much as it did us. Then, just as my legs screamed at me to stop, I saw it. Smoke. A faint, curling plume on the horizon, just visible through the curtain of rain. Look, I shouted, pointing with what little energy I could muster. My voice cracked, hoarse from disuse. Trevor halted, his sharp eyes narrowing as he followed my gaze. A flicker of hope crossed his face. That's a settlement, he said, more to himself than to us. Finally. Heinrich let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders sagging. About time. We pushed on with renewed vigor, the sight of the distant town a beacon in the oppressive gloom. The walls came into view as we drew closer, their sturdy construction a welcome contrast to the endless wilderness we'd endured. This wasn't a shanty town clinging to a guard post, it was a proper settlement, larger and more developed. The sight of the town gates made my chest tighten with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The guards stationed at the entrance wasted no time in making their presence known. 2 men in battered chainmail stepped forward, their spears crossed to block our path. Their faces were hard, their eyes sharp. "What's your business here?" One barked, his voice rough and unwelcoming. Trevor, ever the quick thinker, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just some weary travelers, good sirs. Merchants, left behind by our caravan in the storm." The guard sneered, his gaze sweeping over us with thinly veiled suspicion. "Merchants, eh? Don't look like much of a trade party to me." Trevor didn't miss a beat. He gestured toward me with a casual wave. "The boy's the young master here, from the Ash Kingdom. Potential head of a trading company. Heinrich and I are his hired guards. The storm got the better of us, and we're just trying to catch up with our caravan." The guard's eyes lingered on me, narrowing as if trying to measure the truth in Trevor's words. I straightened under his gaze, doing my best to appear more young master than soaked runaway. My drenched and bedraggled state didn't help, But Trevor's calm confidence seemed to work in our favor. After a tense moment, the guard grunted and stepped aside. "Don't cause trouble," he warned. "Town doesn't need any more headaches." Trevor tipped his head in, "Thanks," and we filed past the guards, stepping into the relative safety of the town. The streets were busy despite the rain, the townsfolk hurrying about their business under hoods and cloaks. The smell of wet earth mixed with the aroma of cooking fires and the faint tang of metal from nearby smithies. The sight of the bustling settlement filled me with relief, though it was tempered by a gnawing worry. The caravan might not even be here. If we couldn't catch up soon, we'd be left stranded in a foreign kingdom with nothing but the clothes on our backs, and even those were soaked through. Trevor's hand clapped my shoulder, pulling me from my thoughts. "First things first," he said. "We find an inn, get dried off, and figure out where the caravan's headed. If it's not here, we'll need a plan to catch up." I nodded, too tired to argue. The promise of warmth and rest was enough to keep me moving, even as my legs threatened to give out. As we wove through the crowded streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us. Whether it was my paranoia or the genuine suspicion of the townsfolk, I didn't know. Chapter 36, Simple Work. The trio trudged through the bustling streets of the settlement, the rain still falling in relentless sheets. It pooled in the uneven cobblestones, forming miniature rivers that trickled toward unseen drains. Despite the storm, the town was alive with activity, its inhabitants darting between cover, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats and dripping hoods. Fires burned in protected hearths, their smoke curling into the gray sky and mingling with the ever-present scent of wet earth and damp wood. I couldn't help but let out a small sigh of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, walls rose around me, high and protective, holding back the wild chaos of the forest beyond. The settlement wasn't particularly large, nowhere near the scope of Valda Ashdock or even the guard post shanty town, but it was a town nonetheless, a place built by human hands, defying the primal dangers that lurked beyond its boundaries. For a moment, the sight gave me a fleeting sense of comfort, as though the very existence of civilization was enough to assure me that safety wasn't so far away. Trevor moved with an ease that bordered on uncanny. His boots splashed through puddles with practiced nonchalance, his sharp eyes darting to and fro as though scanning for familiar faces. It was the way he carried himself, I realized, a combination of confidence and caution that seemed to fit seamlessly into the environment. He navigated the narrow streets like he had walked them 100 times before, though I knew from his stories that he shouldn't have any knowledge of this place. "Keep up, boy," Trevor called over his shoulder, his voice carrying easily over the din of the rain. Heinrich followed closely, his shoulders hunched and his hood pulled low against the storm. I struggled to match their pace, the exhaustion from days of travel weighing on me like an anchor. My boots squelched with every step, the soaked leather clinging uncomfortably to my feet. The inn wasn't much to look at from the outside, a squat, timber-framed building with a thatched roof that sagged slightly under the weight of the rain. A weathered sign creaked on its rusted hinges, displaying a crude depiction of a mug and a bed. Light spilled out from the windows, warm and inviting against the gloom of the storm. Trevor pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and ushered us inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the mingling scents of ale, wood smoke, and a hearty stew that made my stomach growl involuntarily. Patrons filled the room, their voices a low hum punctuated by occasional laughter or the clatter of a tankard on wood. A fire crackled in the hearth, its flames casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. We found a table near the back, tucked away from the main crowd, and sank into the rickety chairs with weary sighs. For a moment, I simply sat there, letting the warmth of the room seep into my chilled bones. My eyes wandered across the space, taking in the simple but sturdy furnishings, the worn wooden floorboards, and the staff bustling between tables with trays of steaming food and frothy drinks. Trevor motioned to one of the serving girls, a wiry woman with a quick smile and an even quicker stride. "We'll take 3 plates of whatever stew you've got on," he said, pulling a handful of coins from his pouch and slapping them onto the table. He turned to me. "And you, boy? What are you having?" I hesitated, my hand instinctively going to the small pouch at my side. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I remembered the caravan, my luggage, my main stash of coin, all left behind in the chaos of the raid. I had only a few coins on me, exchanged hastily at the last tavern near the border. They wouldn't be enough to cover a meal and a night's stay, not in a town like this. "I'm fine," I said quickly, waving off the serving girl before she could jot down my order. My stomach churned, half from hunger and half from the realization of just how precarious my situation had become. Trevor raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Fine, huh? You've been slogging through mud and rain for days, and you're not hungry?" "I'm not. I can't afford it," I admitted reluctantly, my voice barely above a whisper. I braced myself for Trevor's reaction, but even that didn't prepare me for the full force of his exasperation. "You absolute fool," he said, shaking his head with a mix of disbelief and irritation. "You've been carrying yourself like some noble's kid this whole time, and now you're telling me you don't have the coin to eat? You're monumentally stupid, you know that?" Heinrich chuckled, his grin wide as he leaned back in his chair. "Can't say I'm surprised," he said, his tone teasing. "Kid's been one blunder after another since we met him." Trevor didn't let up, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You think you're going to make it out here without food in your belly? Think again, boy." I flushed with embarrassment, my cheeks burning despite the chill that still clung to me. "I know, I just nothing," Trevor interrupted, waving over the innkeeper. The man, a burly figure with a graying beard and a perpetual scowl, approached our table with a questioning look. Trevor gestured toward me. "This one here's going to work off his meal. Put him on dish duty for a plate of stew." My stomach twisted at the thought of more work, but the smell of the food won out. The innkeeper eyed me for a moment before nodding gruffly. "Kitchen's through there," he said, jerking a thumb toward a door at the back of the room. "Start now, and you'll eat when the rush slows down." Trevor clapped me on the shoulder as I stood, his smirk equal parts amused and satisfied. "There's a lesson in this, boy. Don't go walking into towns without a plan, or at least enough coin to fake one." The kitchen was a flurry of activity, the air thick with steam and the scent of simmering broth. I was handed a rag and a stack of dirty plates, the innkeeper barking quick instructions before leaving me to my task. The work was tedious and repetitive, the constant sound of running water and clattering dishes blending with the muted noise of the tavern beyond. My arms ached, my fingers pruned from the soapy water, but I forced myself to keep going, driven by the promise of food. When I finally returned to the table, my hair plastered to my forehead and my hands raw, a steaming bowl of stew was waiting for me. I didn't bother with pleasantries, digging in with a hunger that bordered on desperation. The stew was simple but hearty, its flavors rich and satisfying. The bread that accompanied it was crusty and warm, perfect for soaking up the broth. For a brief moment, I forgot about the rain, the cold, and the exhaustion, losing myself in the small comfort of a hot meal. Trevor and Heinrich were already sprawled out in their chairs, their tankards empty and their conversation drifting toward the kind of stories men only share after a few drinks. I listened absently, my thoughts beginning to blur as the weight of the past few days settled over me. When we finally made our way upstairs to the shared room, I barely registered the creaking floorboards or the scratchy blankets. The two men were already snoring softly by the time I collapsed onto the narrow bed, my eyes heavy and my mind mercifully quiet. Sleep came quickly, and for the first time in days, it was deep and dreamless. Hex's voice nudged me awake with a calm, measured tone that somehow managed to carry a sense of smug satisfaction. "Your body has rested more effectively than any night in the past week," she announced, her voice an intrusive whisper in the quiet dawn. The room was still dim, the weak light of early morning filtering through the grime-streaked window. "Thanks, Captain Obvious," I muttered, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Despite my sarcasm, she wasn't wrong. For the first time in days, my muscles didn't feel like they were tied in knots, and the lingering exhaustion from our seemingly endless march through the rain was finally beginning to fade. Trevor and Heinrich were already stirring, their movements deliberate but groggy. Heinrich stretched and yawned loudly, muttering something incoherent as he threw his blanket aside. Trevor, on the other hand, was already halfway dressed, his boots thudding against the floor as he stomped into them. "Up and at 'em, boy," Trevor said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "We've got a caravan to catch." I nodded, rolling out of bed and forcing myself into motion. My clothes, still damp from yesterday's rain despite our time indoors, clung to my skin as I pulled them on. The thought of stepping back out into the dreary, wet wilderness filled me with dread, but there was no avoiding it. By the time we made our way downstairs, the inn was bustling with activity. The clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation filled the air, the patrons huddling over steaming mugs and plates of hearty breakfast. We didn't linger, though. Trevor was a man on a mission, his sharp eyes scanning the room and then the streets beyond as we stepped out into the gray morning. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle, but the muddy streets still made every step a careful negotiation. Trevor led the way, his purposeful strides leaving no room for dawdling. I trailed behind him, my boots squelching with every step, while Heinrich brought up the rear, his expression sour but focused. Trevor, I was starting to realize, had a knack for reading people and places. It was like watching a detective at work. He moved with an ease and confidence that made him blend seamlessly into the bustling town, striking up casual conversations with merchants, laborers, and even a couple of guards. Each interaction was brief but deliberate, his questions laced with just enough charm to disarm suspicion. "What's he doing?" I whispered to Heinrich as we lingered near a market stall, pretending to examine its wares. "Finding us a ride," Heinrich replied, his tone clipped. "You'll see." Sure enough, it wasn't long before Trevor returned, his smirk firmly in place. "Found a wagon heading our way," he announced. "Offered our services as extra protection, and the driver was more than happy to take us on." I blinked, surprised by how quickly he'd managed to secure transportation. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Trevor said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Driver's a trader. He's got a load of lumber and supplies heading to a village up the road. Close enough to the caravan's likely path that we'll catch up in no time." The wagon was a far cry from the enchanted caravan we'd lost. It was little more than a rickety wooden cart pulled by a pair of weary-looking draft horses, its bed piled high with rough-hewn logs and sacks of grain. The driver, a wiry man with a scraggly beard and a wide-brimmed hat, greeted us with a wary nod as we climbed aboard. The reality of our situation hit me as the wagon creaked and groaned beneath us, the uneven wheels jolting with every rut and stone in the road. If we were attacked out here, there would be no enchanted barriers, no flame-spewing traps, no trained guards to hold the line. Just us, the driver, and whatever rudimentary weapons we could muster. Hex's voice interrupted my grim thoughts, her tone clinical as always. "Probability of survival in the event of a raid on this wagon, 37.2%. Factors include lack of defensive enchantments, limited mobility, and insufficient personnel." "Thanks, Hexa," I muttered under my breath. "That makes me feel so much better." "Statistical accuracy is not intended to provide comfort," she replied, her tone entirely unbothered. Trevor must have noticed the tension on my face because he chuckled, his usual grin returning. "Relax, boy. Most raids don't hit small targets like this unless we're unlucky. And we've already had our fair share of bad luck, don't you think?" His words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't do much to quell the unease gnawing at my gut. I glanced back at the town as the wagon began to roll forward, the walls shrinking into the distance. They weren't nearly as imposing as the walls of Valda Ashdok, but in that moment, they seemed like a fortress. Leaving their safety felt like stepping into the jaws of the unknown. Trevor seemed to sense my hesitation. "You're getting too attached to walls, kid," he said, his tone light but laced with meaning. "Out here, you've got to learn to rely on yourself. Walls are fine, sure, but they don't move with you. You want safety? Earn it." I didn't reply, my gaze fixed on the horizon. The rain continued to fall, blurring the line between sky and forest. The wagon creaked beneath us, its wheels splashing through puddles as the road stretched on, winding deeper into the untamed heart of the forest kingdom of Drugger.